Hello everyone and welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. So today's case takes place in the north of England in the Victorian era, and this is a bit of a strange one because James Maybrick, today's subject, wasn't a murderer, he was actually the victim. However, things aren't that simple, and I really wanted to cover this case because it's a stark reminder of how times really were different back then in the Victorian era, and especially for women. Not only that, but this man has also been linked to the infamous Jack the Ripper. He was thought of, and some people still think of him as a suspect or, thought to have maybe been Jack the Ripper himself. And we'll get into that a bit later on. So I do want to point out at the beginning of this video that I do use AI images to help tell the story. And with that being said, let's begin. So James Maybrick was born on the 24th of October 1838 in Liverpool. His mother was Susanna Maybrick and his father was William Maybrick. He was one of 5 brothers and he was the third born to his parents. So James's family were a respectable family in the community because his father was the parish clerk for Liverpool's pre-eminent church. And this building's no longer there, it was demolished at some point, but it's now the site of the Anglican cathedral, so that must have been built in its place. So not much is known about James's early life, other than that he had 2 siblings who sadly passed away when they were just children. His eldest brother William had grown up and become an assistant carpenter, and James had a younger brother called Michael. Now Michael was actually famous in his own right because he was a songwriter. Then after that, the next brother in age was Edwin, who James went on to set up a business with. And then the youngest brother was Thomas, who also went into the cotton industry, which is the industry that James and his brother Edwin had a business together in. So like I said, not much is known about James's early life, but when he was around 20, we know that he moved to London and he began working for a man called Gustav Witt. And that was in Fenchurch Street, which is actually very close to where one of the Ripper victims was found, which is what kind of ties him in to being a suspect of being Jack the Ripper. Anyway, Gustav, who he started working with, he was the person who taught James how to trade. So as part of his job, James was sent to America by Gustav, and he took several trips to America and back before actually setting up his own business. So these trips to America at this early stage will become very useful to him later on. So now we get into James's sort of romantic life, and at some point in the 1860s, James began a relationship with a woman called Sarah Ann Robertson. So it's not really clear whether they actually got married or not because there's no record of an actual marriage certificate on any of the registers, but some documentation has been found listing the woman as Sarah Ann Maybrick. So obviously using his surname would have said that they were married. So it's a bit confusing really. They didn't live together and James seemed to be keeping her as a bit of a secret because no one else seemed to really know anything about her. And that will continue as we go on with this case. So it's not known whether James's brothers knew about Sarah, but it wouldn't surprise me because at the time, wealthy men, like James was at this point, they were known to have affairs, they were known to have mistresses, and, they didn't have to tell people about it. It was just accepted as normal, to be honest. So there was no mention of James on the census of 1861 in England, so it's possible that he'd been travelling at that time and he was actually in America then. With his business in the cotton trade, he would frequently make trips to America and back. And the censuses were only taken every 10 years, so, it's a bit difficult to track him down at this point. So on the census of 1871, 10 years later, he was listed as living in Liverpool with his mother. And at this time he was 31. And it was 2 years after this that he then decided to set up his own business with his brother Edwin, who is his younger brother. So they wanted to be cotton merchants, and James already had some experience because of working with Gustav and going backwards and forwards to America. So he knew the trade now and he wanted to set up on his own, well, with his brother. So they set this business up and they called it Maybrick and Company. That's original. So Edwin became a junior partner of the business. They weren't equal partners, probably because he was a lot younger and he didn't have the experience that James did. So after a year of finding the feet in this business, James knew that he wanted to open an office in America. So he travelled there, and he travelled to Norfolk in Virginia, where there was an established cotton port. So he knew that that would be a good place for him to build this business up. So there was 10 years between James and Edwin. James was 31, Edwin was only like just 20. So it made sense that James was taking the lead and he was sort of teaching Edwin as they went along. So James thought that he was going to make a lot of money out of this business, and he was right in thinking this because they were making a lot of money. And, things just grew and grew. They both became quite rich. However, in 1877, James was in America and he had a bit of a health scare because he contracted malaria while he was there. And he saw a doctor who prescribed quinine to James, but this had no effect. So James sought out someone else who gave him a different prescription, and he was prescribed this sort of concoction of different medicines, and it contains strychnine and arsenic, which, today we know, well, that's not a good mix, but back then, they used to put anything in medicines and it was okay. And so James took this, which wasn't a good thing really, because it did make a difference to his condition. It helped him get over the malaria, but it also started a sort of medicine obsession that would last for the rest of his life. And he would rely on this in the future. So back then, it might seem strange now, but back then, arsenic especially was so common in loads of different things and not just medicines. And it wasn't considered dangerous. It was in all sorts of things. The Victorians used arsenic in like wallpaper. There was a bright green colour, and that was called Shields green. And that was really, really popular. And that was used in wallpaper and paintings. And, arsenic was also used in a lot of things with this green colour. So even clothing, so women's dresses would be made using it. And then, coverings, fabric coverings, so the covers on your sofa and bed linen, all sorts. So you can imagine they were just, full of arsenic all the time. And it was mainly the wealthy people that could afford these things. So they were literally like poisoning themselves in their own homes. It's crazy really when you think about it. But it was seen as very fashionable. So obviously all the rich people wanted to do it. So it's a bit strange that they didn't cotton on to it really, because even though it was used in household things, it was still a poison. So it was still marketed and used as poison for like mice and rats and and flies as well. So they did know that it was poisonous. But, the more wealthy and fashionable you were in the Victorian times probably meant the more exposed you were to arsenic and the sicker you probably were. And then you'd go and get a prescription because you felt bad and they'd prescribe you arsenic. So that wasn't really helping, was it? So also the women used to make face powders and things like that with arsenic. They were probably made by pharmacists and sold like that as an extra income for the pharmacist, but they had arsenic in as well, and these women were literally putting it on their skin. So yeah, they could be sat there in a bright green dress, so the fabric's touching the skin, and then all the exposed skin, like the hands and the face, they were putting extra arsenic on there as well. So no wonder they felt so sick. And this is why the Victorians always seemed to feel better when they were outside. So they used to go for a trip to the seaside, and they'd go on about how the sea air made them feel so much better, when realistically it was probably just getting out of the house that was full of arsenic, and breathing the fresh air instead of the arsenic actually made them feel better. So yeah, it probably wasn't that the sea air was healing them, rather their own home was poisoning them. So let's just get back on topic now. So James is making frequent trips to America, his business is really booming, he's making loads of money, and he knew how to spend it. He would go to the most lavish parties and balls, and he'd always be immaculately dressed, and he was known for being quite an extravagant man, an extravagant dresser as well. He had this tie pin with diamonds in it, And he had, he would have a gold watch and chain, and he would smoke the most expensive cigars that he could get his hands on. He really was flashing the cash. And he was flaunting his wealth whenever he could. He was clearly loving this life that he had now. So in 1880, sort of 3 years later, he was travelling to New York, and he was 42 at this point. So he'd been in New York for a while, and then on his way back, he boarded the ship, the SS Baltic. And this was a luxury liner that would take him back to Liverpool. And on this journey, he would meet his future wife. So at the time, she was called Florence Elizabeth Chandler, but we know her as Florence Maybrick because she would go on to be his wife. But at this time, she was only 18 years old when she was on this ship. So she was born on the 3rd of September 1862 in Mobile, Alabama. Her mother was Baroness Caroline von Rock, who was single after her first husband died, and the next 2 marriages broke up. So, she did have trouble in love, it would seem. She'd been married a few times, but she was definitely like a free spirit, and she loved to travel. She was quite a wealthy woman, and she used her money to, take frequent trips. She didn't want to, sit at home all day. She wanted to be out. She wanted to go to places. She was quite adventurous. So she would travel around the world, and she would take her children with her. So she did have a son who was older than Florence, but at the time when her and Florence were on this ship, she was with her mother, but the son was at home because he was studying medicine, so he stayed at home to continue his studies. So while Florence was on this ship, she met James Maybrick, and they sort of hit it off straight away, which is a bit strange to me because there was a really big age gap between them. So you wouldn't have thought that she would have been attracted to him. Maybe it was the money that attracted her. I'm not sure, but there was a 24-year age gap, which is, I think it's pretty big. I mean, 10 years you can sort of understand, but 24 years, that's quite a significant age gap. She was only 18, he was 42. So this gives me the ick a little bit, but Florence wasn't pushed into it by anyone. People on the ship were saying that these two were inseparable since when they met. They were always with each other. Florence was enamored by him. She was so, happy to be around him. So it wasn't, there was no signs there of her being pushed into it at all. So they were enjoying each other's company so much that there were quite a few rumours going around on the ship. In the first class dining room, they were being talked about while they weren't there. And people were expecting there to be an engagement announcement before they hit Liverpool. But that actually didn't happen. Now, as I said earlier, Florence did seem very, very into James and didn't seem like she was being pushed into the marriage or anything like that. But there were also thoughts that maybe the money was running out between her and her mother, and they needed to carry on their lavish lifestyle. And the way that they could do that was Florence marrying into money. So you could take that view as well, but it didn't seem that way from what people said at the time. Now, if anything, rather than push Florence into it, apparently Florence's mother, Carrie, wasn't a fan of the couple. She must have thought, well, kind of what I'm thinking, there's too much of an age gap there. Florence could probably do better. Maybe not financially. But yeah, she wasn't keen on the match at all, but she didn't stop Florence from doing it. She did support her. So the story of how they met is that apparently Florence was walking towards the first class dining car on the ship, and she wasn't really paying attention to where she was going, but it might not have been that. I mean, you think about the big, long, flowy dresses that these wealthy women wore in the Victorian times. They went right down to the floor, so she probably just tripped over a dress. But however it happened, she did trip, and she nearly fell down quite a steep drop. But James managed to catch her just in time, so he must have been right near her. So he caught her basically in his arms. And, this big heroic gesture that he did caught her, and that must have sparked something off in Florence, because this was how, how they met and how the relationship started. Apparently, during his sort of rush to catch Florence, he actually sprained his ankle, so he then couldn't walk. So Florence was then visiting him in his room, checking that he was okay, and, that's how things started. So, like I said earlier, there wasn't an engagement announced on the ship, but after the ship docked, he did go to visit her at the Childwall Abbey Hotel, where she was staying with a Mr. and Mrs. Hazard of New Orleans. So they must have been sort of chaperoning her. It's not mentioned at this point where her mother is. But however it came about, it really was a whirlwind romance between the two of them. And the couple behind closed doors, even though they hadn't, announced it on the ship, they had actually planned to get married. So James must have asked her. But we know some details about James's life that Florence didn't know. So there were a few secrets that he was keeping from her. So what's the first secret that he's keeping from her? Well, we already know that. We know that it's the mistress, don't we? So we talked about her earlier, Sarah Robertson. But James had carried on this relationship. Even when he met Florence, he didn't end the relationship. He actually carried on with it and kept it in secret. And not only that, she'd actually given birth to 3 of his children by this point. So he didn't just have a mistress, he had another family that Florence had no idea about. Apparently, he took care of them financially where they lived, which was near Whitechapel in London. And this was obviously another connection to Jack the Ripper, because that was where, he killed some of his victims. So it was said that maybe he'd been flitting between his home in Liverpool and Whitechapel, and that's how he'd managed to get away and things like that. But anyway, Florence had no idea about this other woman. But again, like I said earlier, it wasn't uncommon for rich men, upper class men, to have mistresses squirreled away. And even though his fiancée was in the dark about it, maybe other members of his family knew that Sarah and the children existed. We're not sure about that. So she was still oblivious, Florence, as she walked down the aisle with James at St. James's Church in Piccadilly. And that was in London on the 27th of July in 1881. So after the wedding, 8 months after the wedding, to be exact, Florence gave birth to the couple's first child, James Chandler Maybrick. So this would have caused a bit of a stir with the gossips, because obviously it's 8 months after the wedding, not 9 months. So Florence must have already been pregnant when she got married, which was, very, very risque back then. It's not the kind of thing you do. So during my research, I actually found out before he married Florence, it turns out that James was actually engaged to a different American woman, the same age. She was 18, but we don't know what happened with that. They never actually got married. Well, we don't think they did. But yeah, so this wasn't the first time that he'd been engaged to a young American, so that was obviously his type. Which, raises the eyebrows again, doesn't it? So it's not like this was just fated, like, oh, I've met this 18-year-old, and even though there's this massive age gap, it's this fantastic romance. He'd done it before. Well, he'd done it twice before, because Sarah Robertson, when he first met her, she was only 18 as well. So yeah, he had a bit of a thing for the younger girls. So James was obviously used to keeping secrets by now, but his mistress wasn't the only one. His other secret was that he was still taking all these potions and tonics almost constantly, and most of them contained arsenic. A lot of people said that he was addicted to arsenic, but then other people have said that, arsenic isn't addictive, and some people say it is, so maybe it was just some of the ingredients in the medicines themselves were addictive. But he wasn't secretive about it with his friends and the other people that he palled about with, the wealthy people. He was fond of telling people that he took arsenic. In fact, he'd tell anyone who would listen. He used to brag about it all the time, basically saying that he took so much arsenic that he was immune to it because he'd been taking it for so long. And this was something that he seemed to be proud of. But a lot of people, I think, just didn't believe him, and they just, there's those people that like to brag about themselves, and they make a lot of things up, and people just think, oh, they're exaggerating, and they just don't listen. So that's how it was kind of seen at the time. But James was, according to his own doctor, a hypochondriac. So he would literally go to the doctor or call for the doctor and say he had this wrong with him or he had that wrong with him. And the doctor was, fed up because, it was all the time and it was all these minor things that, the doctor obviously didn't take him seriously. So he would prescribe him things, but basically just to keep him quiet, just these very, very basic medicines that wouldn't really do anything. So James also wasn't telling the doctor that he was taking all these potions and medicines outside of the doctor's prescriptions. So the doctor didn't really know what sort of state James was in. If he'd known that he was taking all these things, the doctor probably would have said, well, that's why you're feeling like that. But James didn't mention it. He just kept complaining, basically. It's like he liked the attention. So back to James and Florence. So they've got married and they've now got this little baby. And they had, he was James Jr., but they had this affectionate little nickname for him. They called him Bobo, which I thought was quite cute. So they obviously loved him and they took him with them when they went to America. So like James did in his early days before he was with Florence, now the whole family would go back and forth to America because of James's business. And they were quite happy to do that. They were going backwards and forwards on these ships all the time, but, they were wealthy. They were in first class. They weren't, needing anything. They weren't suffering. They were enjoying that lifestyle. They were in luxury all the time. And Florence liked this just as much as James did. And she'd grown up like that. Her mum had brought her up to be travelling the world. And so it was just normal for them. So they also liked to attend balls and parties, and they also liked to attend the races. So this was both in England and America. They would do this in both places. And they were very popular on the social scene. They were always out and about. They always wanted to be seen. And that was just kind of the life that they had. So despite the age gap, they seemed to be getting on really well. And they also had similar interests. They both liked to ride horses and they definitely both liked, the travelling. They liked the finer things in life, that kind of lifestyle. Now, a lot of women around this time were frustrated because they were quite of the view that they were important as well, especially the wealthy ones. They were important as men were, and they wanted to work. They wanted careers just like men did, because they weren't allowed to have careers, women back then. They were, well, you must stay at home and do this and that, and you can't, have your own business, you can't have a job. And a lot of women weren't happy about that, but Florence was. She was perfectly content to just be waited on and be pampered and just stay at home and ride horses. And she used to like painting as well, so she'd do that. And then the other times she would like to go and travel and go to parties and things like that. She was perfectly happy with her lifestyle. So the to-ing and fro-ing between America and England stopped in around 1884 because James officially retired from his American business in Norfolk because the cotton business had been slowly declining recently. And, James was making less and less money, and he saw, the trips to America and things like that, they were making him less and less money. And he thought, well, I need to just cut my losses really and get rid of that part. So that's what he did. And he closed that business down. And then the couple, him and Florence and the baby and James, they moved to Grassendale in Liverpool. So they're still staying in Liverpool, but now they've got this house of their own. But at this time, because he closed his business in America, but he hadn't done it at quite the speed he probably should have done, and he'd lost a lot of money, and the money was going down and down, and he was actually quite worried about his financial situation. I mean, he was still going to all these lavish balls and spending all this money. He was still making sure he kept up appearances, but they really didn't have that much money anymore. So they were it was just kind of a front now. And they were keeping, secrets from people, pretending that they were still in the money when they really weren't. So this was the first time in years that James had to worry about, his finances. He still had an office in England, and so his business continued and he was still making money, but he wasn't making anywhere near the profits that he was used to. And then this the worry had a knock-on effect on his health because although he was already taking substances for these various like made up illnesses that he had, the stress he was under because of his money now caused him to take even more. Although when he was out in public with Florence, he was all show and no one could tell there was anything wrong. You know, he kept that very, very hidden from everybody. So they continued to just put on this show and enjoy this lavish lifestyle. So this carried on. And then in 1886, in June, Florence gave birth to a daughter, so their second child, and they called her Gladys Evelyn Maybrick. And everything seemed to be going well until the next year. So little Gladys is 1 by this point, and James, already being a hypochondriac, he worried about all the illnesses that were around, and that was partly the reason why he took all these concoctions himself, because he thought, and they were advertised at the time, as keeping at bay all these illnesses. You know, if you took these preemptive steps, you took this arsenic and you took this and that, it would, you know, ward away all these illnesses. So he was always concerned about illnesses. And when little Gladys was 1 and James would have been 3, little James caught scarlatina, and there was an outbreak of it in the area where they lived in Liverpool. And so little James had already caught it and he was getting over it, but James was so worried that he took little Gladys and he wanted to get her out of there. He did not want her to catch it as well, because he may have thought, with her being so young, the infant mortality rate in Victorian times was very high, so he probably thought, right, well, if I get her away from here, she'll probably recover. So that's what he did. He took Gladys to Wales, thinking that will keep her safe. And he did keep her healthy. She didn't end up catching it. But while James was away, there was a different kind of trouble brewing back home in Liverpool. So what kind of trouble? Well, let me tell you. Remember the mistress, Sarah? When I told you that they had 3 children together, obviously it's a few years later now, and James had carried on seeing her. So in my mind, his marriage can't have been that amazing with Florence if he carried on seeing this woman and he carried on fathering children, because by this time she'd now had 5 of his children. So he had 5 illegitimate children with this mistress, and Florence had no idea up to this point, because when James went away to Wales, Florence somehow found out about Sarah and the children. So this was a huge shock. She was absolutely floored, but she was also furious with James. She was absolutely livid, because obviously she knew about the 5 children and she knew that they had 2 children, and she'd obviously worked out that James had been seeing her since before they'd even met. So she was furious, that he hadn't said anything, and that, this had been going on for so long and he was still seeing her. So when James eventually came back, Florence's rage had been building for a while and the couple had a massive row. She wanted to go back and live with her mother, but it wasn't so easy for her to do that. Times were different back then. She knew that if she stormed out and left him, like she wanted to do, she would have to give up this lavish lifestyle that she had. And she didn't want to do that for herself, but she probably didn't want to do it for her children either. This is another reason why I think she married James in the first place. I do believe that she loved him, but I think there was a financial thing there as well, because I'm thinking that she also didn't want to leave James because her mother didn't have the kind of money that she used to have. And there was nothing there. Her mother wouldn't be able to keep her in this lifestyle that she'd been accustomed to, and the children. And James wasn't going to give up his children, was he? So she went back to America. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. So you can say what you want about James and Florence, but it's true. It must be true that they loved the children. Well, they loved the legitimate children anyway. So back in the Victorian times, divorce wasn't really a thing, was it? You're talking like 1 in 5,000 marriages might end in divorce. So it was very, very rare that a couple would actually split up. And it was also quite common, as I said earlier, for these wealthy men to have mistresses. And obviously the mistresses, there was no birth control back then. So the mistresses would have children. There would be illegitimate children that were hidden away. And this was quite common. So Florence probably thought, I can't kick up a massive fuss and storm off because he's not done something that's illegal. He's not done something that's really, it's upset me, but it's not really, really wrong in the eyes of the public, in the eyes of the wealthy, especially. So after thinking about it and calming down, she realised that there wasn't really much she could do, and she'd just have to sort of put up with it. If she went back to her mother, even though this is awful because James is in the wrong, really, it would be Florence that would be seen as the bad guy for divorcing him, for splitting up with him and leaving him. And that sounds absolutely ridiculous today, but that's how it was. The woman did not leave the man, under any circumstances. And if he wanted a mistress somewhere, that was his right to do that. I mean, obviously, I think that's disgusting, but back then, maybe it wasn't. Florence was disgusted, obviously. She was really upset. She was really angry. But she decided that she would settle for what she had and she'd just try and get along with it and try and be happy. So they carried on, like as they had before. It can't have been as if nothing happened, but it did seem like that from the outside looking in, because they never discussed this with anyone. They never showed at any point that anything had changed within their marriage. They were still going out. They were still going to the theatre, going to these parties, going to the races, doing everything that they had done before. So no one knew that there was any problems. But also there's still these money problems going on. So James is still self-medicating. So, things aren't doing that well. So in around 1887, there was a letter that Florence wrote to her mother. She was talking about the financial problems. And she was basically saying that James, from going from this really, really wealthy, rich cotton broker, at that time in 1887 when she wrote that letter, James only had £500 left in his bank account. Now that might have seemed a lot for the Victorian times, £500, that's a lot of money. But considering the size of their house, because they didn't just have a big house, they had staff as well, who would look after the children and do all the domestic things. They were living this lavish lifestyle. They had servants, they had staff, they had this big house, they had, all these outings that they were going on, the travelling that they were doing, everything was costing a fortune. So to only have £500 left and not really be making much money, that must have been a really scary time, and scary enough for Florence to write to her mum and tell her about it. So Florence had said to her mother in this letter that James was jumpy, and she admitted to being scared every time there was someone at the door because she thought it might be someone there to collect a debt. And they really didn't want this to happen because they couldn't afford to pay anything back. So financial worries were high at that time, but for someone in the Victorian times, it wasn't sort of the same as it is now. No matter if you were wealthy or poor, whenever you would want to buy something at a particular shop, you would open an account with that shop, and all of your sort of purchases would be put on this account, and that would sort of need to be paid off probably once a month, or I don't know how often they would have done it, but you would have an account. And then when it was time for that account to be paid, if it wasn't paid, then someone would be sent to your house to speak to, the staff about it. And the staff would probably just, hand over the money and settle the account. So, they had accounts with all these different places. And so James and Florence were both worried that people coming to the door were staff from these establishments wanting their accounts to be paid off. And they knew that they were in a difficult position. So they had all these debts that had mounted up, but they couldn't pay them. With the amount of money that James had left in his bank account, that wasn't enough to pay off all these accounts. So if everybody who he owed money to wanted their bills paid at the same time, James would be bankrupt and his social status would just plummet. He would be known as a debtor, which was really bad at that time. So no one would want to speak to him then. So they knew that they had to, even though they were in dire straits with the money, they still had to carry on keeping up appearances. They still had to keep going out and spending money and that they didn't have. James's business would have gone under completely if his peers had found out that he didn't have any money. So they had to just carry on pretending that they did and hoping that business would take off again and that they could make profit again and pay everybody off. So this is how they were living. And this is how they lived for the next 2 years. So they were like, really scraping by for 2 years until it got to 1888. And then James signed the lease for a big property, a mansion called Battlecrease House in Liverpool. And this house was so big, it was totally the wrong thing to do at this time. But again, they were keeping up appearances. So they did this and they hosted loads of lavish balls and parties of their own at this property. But in the background, James was obviously, even though he was, showing to the public and all his friends that he was still the same man he was before, he was still very worried about his financial situation. And he was still, years later, he was still taking all these medicines. And that can't have been good for him. Florence noticed that same year that he was really relying on these medicines more and more. And even though he'd done what he'd done to her, they must have sort of made amends because, she still cared for him and she was worried about him. She wouldn't have been worried about him if she didn't care for him anymore. So James had actually confided in Florence that even though he was taking all this medicine, it never made him feel better. In fact, it usually made him feel worse. So, that didn't help Florence at all. She was even more worried about him then. So the doctor, obviously, it's years later now, and the doctor is still getting called out by James for these things that are wrong with him. And he's still not telling the doctor all these things that he's taking on the side. So the doctor can't really help him. But he knew about James's many illnesses that he had, that he kept always telling him about. So he came again and he checked him over for the umpteenth time. And then, as usual, James never took his advice. And I think, to be honest, from what has been commented by the doctor in the court cases later and things like that, it seems like the doctor probably did know that James was taking this stuff because, to be honest, I think most wealthy men in that time were doing it. So he must have had an inkling that James was doing it. And he must have got a bit fed up with James and thought, oh, right, I'm fed up with this. I'm not prescribing him anything anymore. And he didn't. So the doctor started just giving James basically nutrition advice, saying that you should eat this and eat that and not actually prescribing him any medicine. But this didn't bother James. Instead of listening to the doctor and changing his diet, he went to a local chemist instead who would do what James said. So the local chemist, James was paying him quite a lot of money, so the local chemist made up the potions that James wanted. And James even gave him a list of ingredients that he wanted in this particular potion, and the chemist would just make it up for him. So he did that, and when he first went to this chemist and asked him to make up this potion for him, among other ingredients, it contained 4 drops of arsenic liquor. But then as time went on and James kept going back again and again, he kept increasing the dosage. So it went from 4 drops to 7 drops. But not only that, instead of increasing it to 7 drops, but keeping the frequency the same at which he was taking this medicine, he actually upped that as well. So it was stronger, and he was getting it sent to him or coming in for it more and more often. In fact, at one point, it went from a few times a month to a few times a week, and then it changed to daily. And then by the time Florence became really concerned, James was collecting this medicine, so a brand new bottle of this medicine, several times a day. So he must literally be knocking back this medicine. And that's really not going to be healthy, is it? Considering he's already been taking it for years. He sounds like a drug addict, doesn't he? That's exactly what he sounds like. He's having to have it now all the time. So what he would also do, he would go to the chemist or send someone out to the chemist for this medicine, and he would get more than he needed. So he would have like a stockpile at home so that when he did make the trips abroad that he liked to do, he would always have it with him. So he was never without it. So that kind of says as well that he was probably an addict at this point, if he couldn't do without it at all. So this carried on, the Maybricks carried on attending functions and hosting events at Battlecrease House, which was their home in Liverpool, despite the money troubles and the worries. And then they were introduced while at one of these functions to a man called Alfred Brierley. And he was similar to James in the fact that he was also a cotton merchant. So they had that in common. Even though James wasn't working as a cotton merchant anymore, obviously that had been his business before, so they got talking about that. And Florence took a liking to him as well, and he was a lot closer in age to Florence. He was only 38 years old, so he was older than Florence, but not as old as James. And the three of them kind of struck up this friendship. So whenever they would go out to these functions, they would always sort of gravitate towards each other and they'd always be seen together. And, with the very rich, they would always attend the same functions. So, they would always see the same people. And this little threesome would always be seen together. And then Alfred actually started going to the house, going to Battlecrease House, and he would meet them there. And not just, when everyone else was there, he would go and visit as a friend. So he did become quite close to them. But it seems that he got a bit closer to Florence than he did to James. Now, in March of 1889, so this is the same year that James actually died, Florence travelled to London and she went to Flatman's Hotel in Cavendish Square. And it was there that she met up with Alfred Brierley, but this time James wasn't with her. So they actually stayed together in the hotel, it's reported, as man and wife, and you know what that means, for 3 days. And they didn't really come out of the room, which also says a lot. They had the meals brought up to them in the room and they were basically in there for 3 days solid. So yeah, you can imagine what was going on in there. So I'm not sure when this affair started. It could have started then or it could have started earlier. We don't know. But it had obviously been building up for a while, right under James's nose. Florence had actually told James that she was going to see her aunt and her cousin because her aunt had just had quite a serious operation and she was recovering and Florence wanted to go and visit her and, see how she was. But she hadn't mentioned that she was going to the hotel. So after she was at the hotel, she did go and visit her aunt and her cousin. That much was true. But she just left out the part where she was with Alfred at the hotel. I mean, to be honest, I don't think she was doing anything wrong. I mean, yes, she was having an affair, but when I say I don't think she was doing anything wrong, what I mean is James had already done this. He had a mistress with 5 children. So, why is it so different for women? How come he could go and do that and no one would bat an eyelid, but she couldn't do it? She was a woman. Oh, no, she couldn't have an affair. She couldn't do what he was doing. It's just so unfair and so, so bad on the women. So at this time, James was still seeing Sarah, his mistress. It's not like he'd stopped. He was still seeing her. There was obviously no guilt on his part for, him having this mistress because he never stopped his relationship with her. So in today's world, Florence probably would have divorced him. She probably would have walked away as soon as she'd discovered what was going on. But it was obviously a lot more difficult for her to do that. It was virtually impossible to divorce without losing your social status. And she knew that it wasn't just her that would lose her social status. It was James as well. If they divorced, James would sort of be, a bad guy as well. And all the details would come out. And even with everything that was going on, she still cared for him. She must have still loved him because she didn't want that for him. She didn't want it for herself, but she didn't want that for James either. So she decided to just carry on. So shortly after Florence returned to Liverpool at the end of March, it was the Aintree Grand National. And if you're not familiar with that in the UK, it's held in Liverpool every year still to this day. So it is a very popular event and it was back then. So on this particular day, it was extra special because the Prince of Wales was reported to be attending. So everyone who was anyone wanted to be there and they wanted to be around the prince and, be introduced to him and things like that. So everyone wanted to go. And this included James and Florence. And it wasn't a surprise to anyone when Alfred Brierley also turned up and made his way over to the Maybricks, which he usually did. And it was a little bit later that Florence and Alfred made a big mistake. After the race had taken place, Alfred wanted to go and see the prince. And he asked Florence to go with him. Now, he asked her in front of James and pretty much in front of everybody, and she agreed to go with him. Now, what's wrong with this, you might think? Well, in today's world, nothing, absolutely nothing. She's just gone to see the prince. But back then, it was like, well, you don't walk off with another man's wife, and she shouldn't be going walking with a man who wasn't her husband. It was like you didn't do that, especially in high society. So this would have caused a massive scandal. Everyone would have looked and been like, that's not her husband. That's not his wife. What are they doing together? Why are they walking arm in arm? Which is what they did, apparently. So Alfred had made sure that he asked the question very loudly in front of everybody so that everybody knew. And I don't know whether this was because he knew that then James couldn't say no, or whether it was that he kind of wanted everybody to find out and then he could be with Florence. I don't know if that was on his agenda at all. So anyway, Florence agreed, and it was clear that she wasn't really thinking about anything because she was so excited about seeing the prince. So she didn't really think about, oh, well, I shouldn't really be going with Alfred. It seems like she was quite childish in some ways, and in this case in particular, she was so, excited to go and get introduced to the prince that she didn't really think about that this might be the wrong thing to do and that she should have gone with James instead. She was just happy to go, and she went. So James watched them walk away, and he was quietly simmering with rage, which built and built the more time that they were away. If they'd have just walked away together, walking next to each other and talking, it probably wouldn't have been that bad, but it was the fact that Florence linked her arm through Alfred's, and that was something that only husbands and wives did. If the woman wasn't married, she wouldn't have done that with another man unless it was like a brother or a father. It wasn't something that was done. And she was doing this in front of everybody who was at the races. So James saw it as that, she was completely humiliating him. But I don't think she saw it that way at the time. I mean, I think she did later on when she sort of calmed down a little bit and realised just what she'd done. So by the time Alfred and Florence returned to James, he was seething. He was absolutely furious. And he told Florence in front of everyone how the whole of Liverpool society had seen what she'd done. And he immediately told her that they were leaving, and they travelled back to Battlecrease House in silence. So when they arrived back at the house, the staff could tell that something had happened. And I want to mention at this point that the staff at Battlecrease House didn't like Florence. I'm not sure if it was because of the age gap between her and James, but they saw her as a gold digger. And probably, because of the age gap. But not only that, they didn't trust her. She was a foreigner, she was from America. And, the British have very high expectations when it comes to, especially the wealthy. When it comes to things like this, it's like, oh, she's all the way from America. She's 20 years younger than him. There's no way she can want him for him. She must just want his money. And this is apparently how the staff saw her. So they saw it as she was there just taking advantage of their master. And one of the staff who felt like this was the children's nurse, and she was called Alice Yap. And she would form a big part in this case that's about to unfold. So Alice liked to gossip about Florence quite a lot. And she did have a very fitting name, Yap. She liked to yap about what she'd seen and what she'd heard. And I don't know if many of you have watched Downton Abbey, but that is like sort of indicative of how the staff and the owners of the houses, how they behave towards one another. I know in Downton Abbey, it's set quite a lot later than this, but it's still the same kind of dynamic. You've got the staff downstairs and they're all sat round a table having a gossip after dinner's done and everything, and they're all saying, oh, we heard this and we heard that, and you get all that. I can imagine Alice Yap sat at the table down there in those kitchens, telling everyone about what she's heard and seen. And everyone would have known that Alice had much more of a relationship with the owners, with Florence and James, because she was a children's nurse and she was allowed to go in places that the other staff weren't. Normally staff were seen and not heard. They didn't really speak to the the owners of the house, but Alice would have done because she would have needed to communicate with them about the children. So she was in a really good position as far as gossip was concerned, and I bet she loved that. So Alice obviously noticed a commotion and wanted to know what happened that day. So she waits until the Maybricks are in the children's nursery, because as soon as they came home, even though there was something wrong, they did arrive at home, like in the house separately. There was 10 minutes between when Florence arrived and when James arrived. So Florence comes in first and she goes straight to the nursery to see the children, and then James follows her after. So Alice, when they're both in the nursery, Alice, Yap, stands outside the door listening. You can imagine her, can't you, with her ear against the door. But she was listening and she heard James say, "This scandal will be all over the town tomorrow, Florrie. I never thought you could come to this." He also told her that if she left, she could never come back. So Florence must have, been having an argument with him and saying she wanted to leave. Just probably like she did when she found out about him and his mistress. And he must have lashed out at her too, because when Alice entered the room after James had gone downstairs, she could see the beginnings of a bruise on Florence's face that would soon be a black eye. And this was when Florence couldn't take it anymore, and I really do feel for her. Her husband was still seeing his mistress on a regular basis, but she wasn't allowed to walk with another man in public. That's how it must have seemed to her, and to be honest, I agree with her. It really wasn't fair. She spoke to a few people about leaving him, but none of them were any help to her, particularly James's brothers. I don't know if she actually said that she wanted to leave him to James's brothers, but she must have said that she was unhappy. She was a woman. She wasn't meant to make a scene or be treated fairly, was she? And obviously, James's brothers are men as well, so they wouldn't have understood. But Florence had also been keeping a secret of her own apart from her affair with Brierley, which made things a bit more difficult and may have been why she hadn't left James earlier. So Florence had built up some debt. She was a young wealthy woman used to a certain standard of living, and as I said earlier, they were falling on hard times and she couldn't really manage this. She still liked to go and spend money, so she had borrowed money and she'd ended up getting in, quite a bit of debt that she couldn't settle on her own. So she did end up confiding in the family doctor, and he told her that the best thing for her to do would be to come clean to James about it, and maybe he'd help her. And she didn't really want to do this because it was just another thing for him to be angry at her about. And he'd already given her that black eye. So, I'm not surprised she didn't want to tell him. So, yeah, he did. He was known for having a nasty temper. And while I've not said this before, he did. Even his friends knew that he had a short temper, which would explain him hitting Florence the night after the races. So it was understandable that she didn't want to make him angry if she could help it. But she did find the courage to tell him. And when she did, she was shocked because he didn't get angry at all. He even said that he'd pay off all her debts. And for a while, the couple seemed to get along again and things were okay. So she'd ended up in that situation because when they were struggling for money a bit, James asked her to be careful with her spending. But like I said, she didn't really know how to do that. So instead, she'd been using her jewellery as collateral to borrow money. And I don't know who she was borrowing this money from. But she was probably thinking and hoping that James's business would take off again and they'd be fine, and she could pay it back. But that hadn't happened. So unfortunately, this truce ended with another argument. And I don't know what this one was about, but James decided then that from that point on, he wanted to see any letters that arrived for Florence before they were given to her. So he told the staff that they weren't to give any letters addressed to Florence straight to her. He had to see them first. And so this was probably, to be honest, to do with these debts. And he then wanted to know if there were any more debts that she hadn't told him about. So that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So a lot of the time, when a letter would arrive for Florence and he didn't know who it had come from, he would send it back without it being opened. And he wouldn't tell Florence about it, so she didn't know. Maybe this was another delaying tactic so that he didn't have to pay debts back. Maybe if he just returned the letters, then the people who sent them would know that that they hadn't been read, so they didn't know about the debt and things like that. So it could have just been like that, just a delaying tactic. So James was still taking all these potions and medicines, And at this point, he'd started complaining of more serious ailments, including like he had numbness in his limbs and he had headaches almost constantly. So he told Michael, his brother, and Michael apparently knew, according to James, he apparently knew about the medication and questioned him about it. And as we know, James has got a short temper and he's also like an addict where he doesn't want to admit that anything's wrong. So he's telling Michael about his health issues, and Michael's basically saying to him, well, do you not think it's anything to do with these medicines that you keep taking? And James sort of flew into a rage and he didn't want to speak to Michael about it and he wouldn't let the conversation go any further. So Michael just dropped it. He was obviously used to the way his brother was. So because James carried on taking the medication and didn't listen to anyone, he was getting steadily worse. As we now know, denial is a common trait of drug addicts or, addicts of any kind, really. They try to pretend that nothing's wrong and, that whatever they're doing isn't causing the problems, that it's got to be something else. So he was one of these people. We know arsenic was one of the deadly ingredients in his medicine, but opium probably was as well. And opium, as we know, is highly, highly addictive. So it could have been that he was addicted to the opium and not the arsenic. But whatever it was, he was definitely addicted to this stuff. So there was another ingredient, as well as the opium and the arsenic, there was also strychnine. And this was really dangerous. I mean, we know now today how toxic it is. And it's used in pesticides and rat poison. So, it's used to kill things. It's used to kill living creatures. So it's a poison, you should never, ever take it internally. But that's exactly what he was doing. And also, it's now been linked with the numbness that he was saying that he had. That has been linked with strychnine. So it goes to show that his medicines were causing him these ailments, these problems. So as well as James visiting various chemists in his area for his medicines and his tonics, they were also being sent for, further afield. So there would constantly be these deliveries of medicines to the house. So he's doing that, and then towards the end of April, so we're about a month after the races now, Florence went out and she bought some fly papers. And this would be something that she would really regret because they were sheets containing arsenic that were soaked in water. And what happened was the water, when they were soaked in it, it released the arsenic from the papers into the water, and then that attracted the flies to it, and then the flies died in this solution. So this is quite important for later on, so remember this. So it was also around this time that James Maybrick spoke to his solicitor and he decided that he wanted to change his will. So this wouldn't work out for Florence very well at all. He seemed to not be thinking of her when he wrote this will. And it might have just been because he was still angry with her for what she'd done for having this affair. And he was angry with her for, piling the debts up. Maybe he didn't want her to have any of his estate because he thought she would spend it, just witter it away. And then there wouldn't be anything left for his children, if he died. So he basically made this will naming his brothers, Michael and Thomas, as trustees for the children. But he left Florence with practically nothing. There was a clause stating that she could stay in the house after he'd died, but only if she didn't remarry. Most of James's estate, including all the furniture in the house, was left to the children. But this was on trust with his brothers Michael and Thomas. And this was for when they were older. So if he did die anytime soon, Florence would be left to raise the children with virtually no money. So it wasn't really very well thought through. So Florence did have a couple of life insurance policies in her own name, and that would give her about £200 a year. And she got an allowance of around £120 per year from America. So it might have been left to her by her father because he was quite a wealthy banker. So he probably left a trust for her because, as we know, women in that time weren't allowed to work or make any of their own money. So, the fathers, if they were in a wealthy family, the fathers would leave money on trust for them for when they were older. And that must have been what she was getting. So this in total would have been around £38,500 in today's money, which seems to me a huge amount of money. In dollars, that would have been $52,000 per year. That's quite a lot. But it wasn't a lot for an upper class woman living in a mansion with 2 children and a whole load of staff. And also, the lifestyle, the clothes that she was getting, the food, and, the balls and the banquets and the parties that were being held. That wouldn't have covered anything near how much they were spending on stuff like that. So, it wouldn't have been enough for her to actually stay at Battlecrease House and raise the children in the way that she was used to. So this will didn't really make sense. So after this, James continued to complain about his health, but he also continued ordering medicines and taking too much of them. So his ailments were getting worse and worse, although he wouldn't admit it or believe anyone when they told him to stop taking them. I can imagine how frustrating this must have been for anyone in the house, not just Florence. This man sounds so infuriating, but he was the man of the house. He was a very wealthy man, and, I suppose his word was the end of everything. You just did what you were told, and, you couldn't argue with him, especially if you were a woman or a servant. So Florence at this point was getting fed up, and she told the servants what James was taking, maybe to help them understand why he was acting so strangely, because, he was complaining of the ailments, but his temper was, he always had a short temper, but that was getting worse as well, and he was beginning to act not like himself. So Florence told them, he was taking this medicine, and, maybe she was doing it so that they could understand. The atmosphere in that house must have been awful, especially for Florence. She must have already felt trapped, but, things must have been far worse at this point. I mean, her husband's acting weird, and she's scared of him because he's already hit her once, and she's sort of trapped in this marriage that she's not happy in, and the staff all hate her. So yeah, it sounds like a wonderful life, doesn't it? The only thing probably keeping her there was her children. So around this time, James went out to his office. He was still going to his office, even though he was complaining of not feeling well. He was still going out. He did have an office actually in the house. It was in one of the downstairs rooms, which he kept locked. So that's where he would, do his work at home and things. But he did have an office in Liverpool as well that he would travel to. So he was still going there. But he worked in this office with Edwin, his brother. And so on this one particular day, he went to the office, and his legs were feeling numb again, which we know now was the strychnine that he was taking. And he did admit to someone, I don't know if it was Florence or if it was Edwin, but he did admit to someone that he had taken too much strychnine a few hours earlier. So he did know that he was taking too much. He did know that he shouldn't have been taking what he was taking. So, for an addict to even admit that they've taken too much, that's saying something, isn't it? So he was complaining of his legs going numb, but then he was taking even more of the medicine to stop the numbness in his legs, which was being caused by the medicine. So it just doesn't make sense, does it? Even though it was the 1800s, people must have seen the connection apart from him himself. I'm sure he knew. But other people must have put 2 and 2 together as well. But like I said, did they know, and they just didn't want to ruffle any feathers? He was the boss. They didn't want to tell him, and he had this short temper, so they didn't want to make him angry. I can totally understand why no one really said anything. At the end of the day, he was a wealthy man. It was his business what he did with his money and what he took. So they didn't want to tell him he was being stupid, even though he was. So the day after this, it was even worse, and he was actually in bed. He was that bad. So, and he was unable to get up. So he didn't go to the office or anything. And he was clearly upset. And Florence asked Nurse Yap to go to the cook and ask for some mustard and water, which, doing a bit of research, I now understand. Because when I first read this, I was like, mustard and water, why is she giving him that? But apparently, on all of the old medicine bottles, it does say that if you've taken too much, if you've overdosed on this medicine, take mustard and water because it will make you sick. And then obviously you'll throw up the extra medicine, and that's seen as kind of an antidote to it. So that is why she asked the cook for this mustard and water. So she then confided in Nurse Yap, the worst person she could have confided in, that James had yet again took some more of his nasty medicine, and that was probably why he was so bad. So Florence, she was telling them what was going on. So then the doctor was called, And this was a Dr. Humphreys. He wasn't the doctor that had been the family doctor that had already been to see James loads of times. This was a different doctor. And when he arrived, Florence told him about the white powder that her husband had taken. But the doctor questioned James about this, and as usual, James was a bit snappy and basically said, oh, that's got nothing to do with how I'm feeling. So he wouldn't accept, even from the doctor, that what he'd taken had anything to do with what was wrong with him. So what was the doctor going to do? Was he going to argue with him? At this point, Dr. Humphreys, he wasn't a new doctor. He had seen James before, so he knew what James was like. And he probably knew that James was taking other stuff as well. So he thought, well, instead of prescribing anything that's going to add to this list of things he's already taken, he just decided to make him this diet sheet. So just to sort of make him change what he was eating and see if that would do any good. Basically, he was just trying to fob him off because he knew that he wouldn't listen to advice anyway. So what was the point? So knowing that his brother wasn't well and seeing him ill at the office the day before, Edwin, James's younger brother, came to stay for a few days. So after those few days, James recovered enough to go back to work and Edwin went back home. So James had even recovered enough to take Florence to a masked ball. And apparently they both really enjoyed this ball, and everyone in society, was pleased to see them, and it was business as usual. So, James, by this point, he was very good at pretending. And that's exactly what they did at this ball. He was pretending, and so was Florence. They were pretending to be the happy couple, as they always were, and, putting on a show. So, we're going to get to early May now, and James was ill again. And again, Dr. Humphreys came to check on him. And this time he did give him a prescription, and he prescribed Valentine's meat juice, as well as prussic acid and a mouthwash of Condy's fluid. So let's just break this down so you get an idea of what this doctor was giving James, bearing in mind that he knows James is already taking concoctions of his own. So first of all, the Valentine's meat juice. So it's exactly as it's described. It was a liquid that beef had been cooked in, and then it was reduced to form a thicker liquid, and then egg whites were added into it. It would have helped someone who wasn't able to keep any food down. It would sort of, I suppose, line the stomach so that they might be able to eat and, get some energy back. So it was more of a food. It wasn't a medicine in that sense, but it was actually still sold up until 1986. But by then it was just used as a flavouring for food, sort of like instead of an OXO cube or a stock cube. So that was the Valentine's meat juice. And then prussic acid is better known now as hydrogen cyanide. So I'm sure you all know how dangerous that was. So yeah, why put cyanide in a medicine? But this is what they did. They didn't realise how dangerous it was. So that was also prescribed. And then Condy's fluid was potassium permanganate. And that was basically an antiseptic, and it was used for skin conditions. So maybe the doctor told him to put this on his legs to deal with the numbness. I did do a bit of research on it and I found out that that's what it was used for, but it was also sometimes used as a kind of cough medicine. So maybe it was taken internally as well. It might have even been the doctor still just trying to fob him off because he didn't know what was wrong with him, or he knew that James wouldn't listen and wouldn't stop taking his other stuff. So after this, Dr. Humphreys changed the prescription a few days later because James wasn't getting any better, surprisingly enough, being given cyanide as well as everything else. No surprises there. So this prescription was changed and he prescribed Fowler's solution instead. And what did Fowler's solution contain? Well, it contained arsenic. So yeah, it didn't contain a lot of arsenic though. There was a tiny amount of arsenic in it. It was mainly other ingredients. So it was a carbonate of potash and lavender water with a little bit of arsenic in it. So maybe Dr. Humphreys knew that James was already taking arsenic, and if he explained that this was medicine with arsenic in it, maybe James would stop taking his own medicine and would take this instead, and then he would get better. Maybe that's what he explained. to James, hoping that that's what he'd do and he'd get better. I mean, this is just my opinion. I don't know that. There isn't any proof to say that, but it does make sense. So we now know that arsenic isn't removed from the body naturally. Arsenic is one of those things that stays in your system and it actually accumulates in your body. So over the years, you can imagine how much arsenic was building up in James's body. And it mainly affected the liver and kidneys. So every time he took it, he was closer to an overdose and closer to death, really. To be honest, I'm surprised that he'd lived for so long, the way that he was treating his body. So it was the same day, so when this prescription got changed, that Alfred Brierley wrote a letter to Florence. And he'd been worrying, thinking that James had found out about their affair, or at least that he was suspicious of it. So he wrote this letter saying that he thought the best thing to do would be to go away for a while and keep his head down, basically. So yeah, he didn't want it to all come out about the time that they'd spent together in the hotel. So yeah, he sounds like really supportive, doesn't he? That he's just going to go off. So yeah, I don't know whether that's, he was just defending himself, just looking after himself, sod Florence, I'm just going to go away so James doesn't get me. So I don't know whether that was what it was or whether Alfred thought he was doing the best thing for Florence. So I think this must have made Florence feel even more trapped than she already was, because now she had no one, to go to. She had no one to write to. And it's not clear whether they were still seeing each other at this point, actively, or whether it was just, they were writing to each other on and off. So the day after this was the 7th of May, and Florence sent a telegram to Edwin, James's younger brother, asking for a doctor because James was getting worse. The doctor had gone, Dr. Humphreys had gone, and he was getting worse. He wasn't getting any better. So Edwin sent, I think this was his own doctor, so Edwin sent a Dr. Carter rather than Dr. Humphreys this time. Maybe this was because Humphreys wasn't getting anywhere and Edwin wanted a second opinion. So Dr. Humphreys did actually come to the house as well, but after Dr. Carter had already been there and examined James. So after this had happened and Dr. Humphreys arrived, they examined James together. Maybe two heads are better than one kind of situation. And they told Florence that they'd checked him and that they thought he was getting better and he should be up and about in a few days. And so Florence was surprised because, James, at this point, James was violently vomiting while the doctors were there. And Florence must have been like, he's going to get better? What? It doesn't look like he's getting better. He's throwing up everywhere. But yeah, that's what the doctor said. So, who's she going to believe? She believed the doctors. They were medical professionals. They knew better than her. So, plus they were men and she was a woman. So, yeah, so she must have just been like, right, okay, whatever. Now, it did seem like the doctors didn't try and find out what was wrong with James, but maybe that was because they already knew that it was because of his self-medicating. So medical science wasn't the best at this time, and to be honest, a lot of it was just guesswork. So they might have been of the opinion together that while he was bedridden, even though he was vomiting and things like that, maybe this was that bad medicine that he was taking coming out of his system, because obviously while he was in bed, he didn't have access to his medicine, Well, we're assuming he didn't. He couldn't take it anymore because he wasn't there to take it himself. And, so maybe they thought he would get better just on his own because he wasn't taking it. So up to this point, we haven't really talked about Michael Maybrick, and he was James's closest brother in age. So he was 3 years younger than James, but he was older than Edwin. And he was actually a pretty famous guy. As we've said at the beginning of this case, Michael was a songwriter. He wrote, quite a few songs that are still used today. He was not only a songwriter, he was a performer. So he would, go and sing his songs and, he was quite well known. And he was also wealthy because of this. And because of that, he was well respected in society. So in my opinion, this made him quite arrogant, kind of like James really. And he was quite pushy. So he'd not been at Battlecrease House while James was ill, but he had been kept informed by Edwin. So up till this point, he hadn't been there, but it was now that he decided he was going to try and take over. He was going to come in and interfere with what was going on. So the first thing he did was he contacted a woman called Mrs. Matilda Biggs, and he asked her to go round to James's house, probably to report back to Michael what was happening. Now, this would have been strange anyway, this woman just turning up at the house to tell Michael what was going on. But Mrs. Biggs had actually been, in the past, one of James's girlfriends, like years and years before him and Florence met. Now that's weird. So this must have made it awkward for Florence, because she must have known about this. So Mrs. Biggs didn't arrive on her own, she arrived with her sister, and she was adamant that Florence should pay for a properly qualified nurse to attend to James. But Florence wasn't happy about this. She saw it as that she was his wife and she should be the one that was caring for him. And it's not like she hadn't done anything. She got the doctors involved. She got Edwin involved, who then got a doctor. And, Florence must have felt like her nose was being pushed out because she had tried to help, but now she was getting this backlash. So she wasn't happy, especially that she was being told what to do by James's ex-girlfriend. Everyone would feel that way, surely. She was his wife now. She did agree, though, because obviously James isn't getting better, so she was worried about him, so she did agree to get the nurse. And the next day, the nurse arrived at Battlecrease House, and her name was Ellen Gore. And once she was there, she saw to a new patient straight away. She made a note of his current condition. James told her, because he was still, he was sat up and he was speaking, he told her that his throat was itchy, as if there was a hair in there that he couldn't get out. So Ellen had brought another nurse with her, because obviously Nurse Gore could only do so long before she would have to get the other nurse to take over so that she could sleep. So this other nurse's name was Nurse Callery. So what happened then was there was a nurse by James's side all the time, because whenever Nurse Gore wasn't there on duty, it was Nurse Callery that was. So they did give him different medicines during that time, probably the medicines that had been given to them by the doctors. So Valentine's meat juice was one of these medicines. And I say medicines because we know it's not really a medicine, but that's what they were giving him. And this was being kept in a drawer in James's bedroom, I'm assuming next to his bed. And Florence was seen taking this out of the drawer on the night of the 9th of May. And she took this bottle of meat juice into her dressing room and she closed the door. It wasn't fully closed, but she closed it too, which, the nurse saw her doing this. And so it was a bit strange. It was like, well, why is she doing that? I'm not sure if Florence knew that the nurse had seen her, but after a few minutes, Florence came back out with the bottle of meat juice in her hand. So she took it back into the bedroom with her, and then she asked the nurse to go downstairs to the cook and go and get some ice so that she could cool James's head. Cool a flannel or a handkerchief and put it on his head, cool him down. And obviously this was a bit strange as well. Why would she ask the nurse to do that? So remember Nurse Yap? So this isn't a nurse, this is the children's nurse, so she's more like a nanny. So the children's nanny was the one who liked to gossip. Well, we already know she didn't like Florence. And when she heard about, because you can imagine the gossip going around in this house, the nurse had obviously told someone that she'd seen Florence with this meat juice bottle, because Nurse Yap found out. Unless she was just listening at the door, or she could have been watching. But anyway, she found out and she loved this. She had this piece of gossip and she immediately took the meat juice from James's bedroom and she took it downstairs to those sisters. So Mrs. Biggs and her sister were still there at the house, and Nurse Yap went to them with this meat juice and she was basically insinuating that it was a really bad thing. Her exact words were, "The mistress is poisoning the master." That's actually what she said to these two women. So during her gossiping, she'd also learnt that Florence had been soaking the fly papers she bought in some water. And where was she doing this? Well, in the dressing room where she took that meat juice. So, yeah, I've been with Florence up to this point, really felt sorry for her, but this is where it gets a bit iffy. This is where it gets a bit suspicious. So, fly papers are poison, and the time of year it wasn't the time where there were a lot of flies. It wasn't summer yet. I mean, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but in the UK, we don't get flies until the weather's warm. And in April and early May, the weather's not warm yet. So this was something else that Nurse Yap told the sisters. So she made it sound like Florence was feeding this liquid to James, and that she'd put that flypaper liquid containing poison in the meat juice. So, she might have actually thought that's what was going on and she was protecting James. I wouldn't blame her for that. And Florence's behaviour was a bit dodgy. Yeah, that's not, it's not painting her in the best light, is it? But there could have been an innocent reason. So the sisters believed the nurse, and they immediately went to send a telegram to Michael Maybrick, because they were supposed to report on what was going on to him, weren't they? So they sent this telegram, and the words in this telegram were, "Come at once, strange things going on here." And so, yeah, Michael Maybrick has now been informed, and he must make his way over to the house. But it was around this time that Florence made another mistake, and that was that she wrote a letter to Alfred Brierley. And I can understand why. She must have felt ganged up on. The staff didn't like her, and now these sisters were there bossing her about. They didn't actually come out and tell Florence what the nanny had said. So Florence was in the dark about that. She didn't know that this nurse, who she was kind of confiding in, was going behind her back and telling these sisters everything she was doing, or everything she thought she was doing. So, she wrote this letter to Alfred. There must have been an awful atmosphere in the house. She must have felt bad, and she must have felt like she didn't have a friend there at all. And Alfred was the only person who had treated her fairly and treated her well, and she wanted to talk to him. So a letter was the next best thing. She couldn't invite him to the house because of everything that had gone on at the races. She couldn't be seen with him, so she couldn't invite him to the house. So she wrote to him instead. So it would look as though she was still having this affair with him, even if it wasn't, they weren't actually seeing each other in person anymore. So who did she give the letter to post it? Yeah, she gave it to the nanny. She gave it to Nurse Yap. And obviously, yeah, Florence had no idea that Nurse Yap was accusing her of all sorts, basically accusing her of trying to kill her husband. So yeah, Florence handed over the letter and asked Nurse Yap to post it, but she never did. Are you surprised? So Alice Yap's story, and she would continue this on right throughout the court case after James's death. She said that she'd gone to post a letter, she'd gone out of the house, and she'd actually took little Gladys with her, who was only a toddler at the time. So yeah, little Gladys was walking next to her, and she'd given Gladys the letter to hold while they walked to the post office. Now, if this letter was important, you wouldn't have let a little kid hold it, would you? Because you know what they're like for dropping things. Well, apparently that's exactly what happened. Little Gladys dropped the letter in a puddle on the way to the post office. So, because of this, she was actually able to see that the envelope was wet, and so she had to take the letter out of the envelope, didn't she? Otherwise she couldn't post it because it needed a new envelope now that it had fallen in the mud. So when she took the letter out of the envelope, she accidentally saw some of it. So she was quite shocked by what she saw, and she said that she didn't read the rest of the letter. Of course she did, come on. She definitely read the rest of that letter. But anyway, she saw some of the words in the letter accidentally, and she was so bothered by it that she had to take it straight to Edwin Maybrick. So that's what she did. She brought the letter back, didn't post it, gave it to Edwin. And I'm going to show you the letter because this is how it read. So I'll just read out part of it. So the whole letter is there, but part of it reads, "Your letter undercover to John Kay," which means she was getting around James finding her letters to Alfred by using a fake name. So this John Kay, she must have used that instead of Alfred so that James wouldn't know she was writing to Alfred. Or this is what it seems anyway. So it also says, I've been nursing day and night. He's sick unto death. Now, this part, he's sick unto death, is very important, so remember that. Also, she called Alfred her darling and told him how she knew that James didn't know anything about their affair. So she thinks that James is totally in the dark and doesn't know that they're seeing each other. So unfortunately, Florence's letter not only admits her affair, but it also claims that her husband is deathly ill. And Michael mostly, but Edwin as well, took the view that she'd been purposely allowing their brother to suffer by not getting a nurse for him earlier, when he was clearly unwell. So they thought, she knew that he was getting worse and worse and, wasn't happy in the marriage, so was just letting him suffer. It's a bit of a nasty thing, to say about Florence, isn't it? But I can understand it a bit more because obviously they've had this conversation together after they've seen the letter that she sent to Alfred. So up to this point, neither of them would have known that she'd been having an affair, but now they knew. So they're bound to, see her in a different light now. They don't like her anymore. She's gone behind James's back. So I wonder if they knew anything about James's affair and James's 5 illegitimate children with Sarah. I've no idea whether they did or they didn't. So Florence had called for the doctor many times, so it wasn't fair that Michael was accusing her of not looking after him, and Edwin as well. 2 doctors had seen James at the same time and thought that there wasn't anything wrong with him. And also the family's doctor, Dr. Hopper, he's also been to see James on various occasions. So this is 3 doctors now that have been to see him. It's not that she wasn't doing anything and allowing him to suffer by not having a nurse. She was getting doctors out. So really, what more could she have done? I mean, she could have got him a nurse to be with him all the time. But yeah, the outcome of Michael's verbal attack on Florence was his decision that she wasn't to have anything to do with food or medicine for James from then on. Only Nurse Gore was to have anything to do with that. So from this, it sounds like not only do Michael and Edwin know about the affair and the letter, because obviously it's Nurse Yap, it's this, the gossipy nanny that has given Edwin the letter. And she must have also told Edwin about everything else, like about the meat juice and everything like that. And if it wasn't her, then the sisters would have told him and Michael, about this. So they knew all this stuff now. And so for Florence, it really wasn't looking good. So Michael actually travelled to Dr. Humphrey's office and saw him there instead of having him come to Battlecrease House, probably so they could speak in private, because he told him about his suspicions of Florence. And the doctor told him that James had said to him in confidence that he knew he was going to die. Now, he shouldn't have really said that, because the last time Dr. Humphreys had seen James was when he'd been violently throwing up and in a lot of pain, so it's not surprising that James thought he was going to die. And with him being a hypochondriac, you can just imagine it, can't you? Oh, I'm going to die. He was basically saying he was going to die when there was nothing wrong with him. So when he's when he's that sick, of course he's going to say things like that. So it's not surprising. But this just fueled Michael even more, and he went back to Battlecrease House to make sure that he watched everything that was going on from this point. So he told Nurse Gore that she was the only one to have anything to do with James. And because of this, she'd sort of done an extended shift. So she'd been working so long and she hadn't had a break. She was absolutely knackered. So when Michael arrived back at the house, he told Nurse Gore that she could finally, come off duty and Nurse Callery could take over. But he said to Nurse Callery the same thing, it's only them that have anything to do with James's food or drink. No one else gives him anything. Meaning he didn't want Florence to have anything to do with his food or drink. So at this point, James was saying that his throat was burning rather than itching. And he also said that he had stomach pains. So the doctors Humphreys and Carter came back that day, and they were subjected to Michael's anger. He demanded to know why James was so ill, And he was angered even more when they both told him they didn't know what was wrong with James. They couldn't tell him why he was so ill. From a doctor saying that they had no idea what was wrong with him. I think that would wind me up as well. They're meant to be doctors, they're meant to know. But unfortunately back then, they didn't, they just guessed. They finally agreed that he might have ingested something with his food, but they still weren't sure. Now this, obviously, Dr. Humphreys has heard from Michael everything that's been going on and that Florence might have poisoned him with the meat juice. So maybe he just said that, to get Michael off his back because, obviously Michael's an angry, wealthy man. He's this very highly respected, famous man. And he probably didn't want to make him any more angry, so he probably just said that to keep him quiet. So Michael then told the doctors that James and his wife were now estranged and that he was suspicious that he was being poisoned and that Florence may have been poisoning him with fly papers. Now the doctors were shocked by this, but they took it seriously and they took samples from James to ascertain whether poisoning was possible, but these results were negative. Over the next couple of days, James got even weaker and Florence didn't help herself by trying to stay involved. She just couldn't stay away. Now, some people might think that this was because she did have something to do with it and she was trying to sabotage James and get him to become even more ill because she just wouldn't leave him alone, even though she was told to stay away from him and not... she wasn't told to stay away from him, but she was told not to give him anything to eat or drink. She was still trying to give James what she thought would be best for him or what James wanted. So Nurse Gore gave James some Valentine's meat juice, but this was new meat juice. It wasn't that one that had been took away. Florence then said that it had made him sick the last time he'd had it. But she wasn't listened to. The nurse didn't listen. In fact, although Florence was legally still James's wife and should have been the acting head of that household, Michael made sure that she was completely ignored and that he remained in charge and no one listened to what Florence said. So unfortunately, I could slap Florence sometimes. It makes me feel that way because she just doesn't help herself at all. If she is innocent, she really wasn't helping herself because Michael actually caught her in the act. Well, he said this. He said he caught her in the act of pouring some medicine from one bottle into another. And she said that there was too much sediment in the bottle and it was making it hard to mix together. And so she was pouring it into a bigger bottle so that it was easier to mix it. But unfortunately, this just added to the suspicion against Florence, and Nurse Gore also asked Michael to take a bottle of brandy out of James's bedroom because apparently he'd had some of that. If he really is that ill, he shouldn't be drinking brandy, should he? So that got taken out. And also the bottle that Michael had seen Florence with got taken out as well. And then Michael gave both of the bottles to Dr. Humphreys and he told him that he wanted them to be analysed. So basically he wanted to see if she was poisoning him. So now we get to the 11th of May, and on this day James was even weaker. And when Dr. Humphreys came to see him, it was clear that he was dying. Florence had called for the sisters to come and see him. And they were at the house, but Florence was on a bed, exhausted. She'd been with James as much as she possibly could, and she was just so tired of being up all the time, up all night and during the day, that she was just exhausted and she was sleeping it off. She might have even took something to help her sleep because, she wasn't getting any sleep. She was worrying about him a lot and she didn't want to go to bed. But, it had finally caught up with her and she knew she needed sleep, so she was asleep. The night before, Dr. Humphreys had found that there was nothing wrong with the bottle of brandy, but the meat juice bottle that Florence had been messing with tested positive for arsenic. So, yeah, that is making it look as though the nanny was right, that, she'd poured some of this flypaper liquid into the Valentine's meat juice bottle and she was going to give it to him. But let's not forget that if she'd already done that, that might have been the case. But Michael caught her with the bottle, so she hadn't actually given it to him. So, yeah, there is suspicion there. So when Dr. Carter came at lunchtime, Dr. Humphreys told him about this, and Dr. Carter said, sort of between themselves, that he would keep the bottle because if James did die, then they would probably need that bottle for evidence later. And it would need to be analysed by, a professional. So it got to 8:40 p.m. that night, and this was when, sadly, James Maybrick died. Unfortunately, Florence was still in a room unconscious at this point, so it's a bit obvious that she had took something to help her sleep because she was out of it. So, after spending night and day with him, and she didn't want to be separated from him while he was so ill, at the point when he actually died, she wasn't there. And this was when Michael Maybrick took it upon himself to completely take over the house. So Florence was now officially the head of the household with James dead, but Michael didn't care, and because he suspected her of killing James, or at least trying to interfere, he ordered everyone to leave the house and made the servants search every room. He wanted them to look for anything that could have harmed his brother. I can kind of understand this. I mean, he'd found out that Florence had been having an affair, and then his brother gets really ill and dies. He's bound to be suspicious, but then he also knows that James has been ill for a long time and he's been taking all sorts of substances for years and years. Common sense should have kicked in and told him that it was probably all James's doing. I think that he didn't want to be embarrassed or the family to be looked down upon, and so he tried to blame Florence for everything. Someone being an addict or a substance abuser would have been scandalous, just as someone having an affair would have been. And he'd never liked Florence, so her having an affair gave him the perfect excuse to shift the blame onto her and paint James as an innocent victim. So this is just my opinion. So coincidentally, it was Alice Yap, the nanny, who found the first piece of evidence for Michael. This was a chocolate box, and inside it were bottles of white liquid and a packet inside the box which said poison on it. And it had arsenic labels on it as well. This box was in a trunk that she'd opened to pack some of the children's clothes in, and she'd immediately gone to Michael with this box. So it just so happened that next door to the Maybricks lived a solicitor called Mr. A.G. Steele. And Michael must have told him what had happened because he asked him what he should do. And Steele told him that the authorities would need to see everything that could be evidence of a crime, and that Michael should make sure that anything that he found should be sealed up and left for them to look at. So Michael followed his instructions and he wrapped the chocolate box and its contents up, and then he took it to the wine cellar where he locked the door. The next day, on the 12th of May, things got even worse for Florence. So by this time she'd woken up to find the whole house being searched from top to bottom, including her bedroom, and all of her personal belongings were being rifled through. The servants wouldn't listen to anything she said. Michael had told them that she wasn't in charge. It was her house, so she should have been in charge, but obviously because Michael was a man, and obviously because of his social status and his wealth, they listened to him instead. I mean, you can see it from their point of view. The servants wouldn't want to cause an argument with the person who was then going to pay them their wages. If they'd have disagreed with him, he could have got rid of them and then they would have had no job. So they were just doing what they were told. Michael wanted to find James's will, but he couldn't find it, and he was getting more and more frustrated. So by this point, Florence must have been so upset. Not only was she being ignored by her own staff, but the sisters who were mentioned earlier were going through Florence's things as well. She just had to sit there while James's ex-girlfriend rifled through her wardrobe, taking everything out. As well as the fact that she's just been told that her husband's now died and she wasn't there when he died. He took his last breath while she was asleep and she woke up to find all this going on. So while she was awake, she wasn't very well. So she was quite subdued, and she, obviously she would have been upset as well because of James's death and with what was going on. So she just sat there and had to put up with this going on around her. So during the search, of Florence's room, Mrs. Biggs found a couple of hat boxes in the wardrobe, and one of them contained a glass with some liquid and a piece of cloth in it. And in the other was a bottle of Valentine's meat juice and some other small bottles. So this was also given to Michael along with everything else. But the next painful blow to Florence, and one that she probably hadn't seen coming, was the fact that her children were taken away from her. I'm not sure how close she was to them because, back in those days, wealthy women wouldn't have really spent that much time with the children. They were mainly brought up by the nannies, and so Nurse Yap, the nanny, probably would have spent more time with the children than Florence and James did. But nevertheless, she still loved these children, and it must have really hurt when they were sent off. But they weren't sent off with just anyone. They were sent to live with the mother of Mrs. Briggs. So if I was Florence, I would have been furious at this point. Those are her children, and surely only she should be making decisions about where they went. I think this was very wrong of Michael, whether he suspected her of something or not. At this point, the police hadn't even been called about James's death. If he thought it was suspicious, why hadn't he called them? And now Michael's sending Florence's children away. I mean, yeah, he's probably sending them away so that they weren't involved in all this. I mean, it must have been awful for them to be witnessing, what was going on. The dad had just died, and then the mum was being blamed for it. I mean, obviously, they wouldn't have been told any of this. They wouldn't have really known what was going on. So for Florence, things didn't get any better after this. In fact, they got even worse because Michael now decided that Florence shouldn't even be allowed out of her room. So he had her locked in her bedroom, apparently. He did deny this during the court hearings afterwards. He said that he didn't do this, but there were other people that said that he did. So I would tend to believe that he did. So yeah, he's taken over the household, which he had no right to do because it was Florence's household. She was the head of that household now that James had died. And he didn't even have the decency to talk to her about it first or tell her that he was sending the children away. He just went and did it. And then he went and told the nurse who was looking after her because she wasn't well. He went and told this nurse basically to lock Florence in her room. His exact words were, "Mrs. Maybrick is no longer the mistress of this house, and I forbid you to allow her to leave this room." So the poor nurse couldn't argue with him and must have been really confused and probably scared. But she would have also seen that Michael and now Edwin were taking over the house and ordering everyone else around. So she would have been throwing her job away if she hadn't have done as she was told. So, like she was asked to, she locked the door, and now Florence was literally a prisoner in her own home. And it was only then that the police were actually told what had happened. An inspector then came to the house, and this was Inspector Baxendale. So he was in charge, and he took the evidence that had been collected by Michael and he interviewed each of the servants separately. Michael, at this point, wasn't in the house now. He'd travelled to London, and so he wasn't there when all this was going on. But I assume that's why Edwin had also been involved, so that the staff wouldn't be alone with Florence and be tempted to let her out or listen to her. So they probably wouldn't have anyway, because Michael sounds like a scary man, and I'm sure none of the staff wanted to cross him. So the next day, Michael returned from London and he gave the police the poison packet. But this bit confuses me. So the police have taken the contents of the hat boxes the day before. So the wine cellar where the evidence was supposed to be kept was opened up, and the police took that evidence. So then why was Michael in London with that packet of poison? Why hadn't that been kept with all the other evidence? This sounds very dodgy to me. Why would he separate that from everything else? He'd already been advised to keep everything sealed up and locked away for the police. We know that he didn't like Florence, so maybe he was trying to frame her. Maybe that poison packet wasn't there to begin with and he'd brought it with him. This would be, a crime now. This would be tampering with evidence, and it wouldn't have been allowed. But things were different back then, and Michael, being an important man, being a famous musician and songwriter and performer, and also very wealthy, He would have had quite a lot of clout, especially, around the wealthy, but also probably with the police as well. So I'm not sure at this point why the police didn't remove Florence from the house, but they didn't. They left her there. Surely they knew that Michael had locked her in a room. So I don't know why they didn't do anything about that either. But this just goes to show, doesn't it, that Michael must have had influence over them. Because what happened to innocent until proven guilty? She's not even been charged with anything. The police didn't suspect her of anything yet. So why was it allowed to lock her in a room? So Dr. Humphreys and Dr. Carter then came back to do the post-mortem examination on James. They were watched over by another doctor, Alexander Barron, and he was a university professor, and police superintendent Brining were also there. So this post-mortem was obviously watched by a lot of people. And it was probably due to the fact that this was a suspicious circumstance and they wanted to make sure that there was no foul play. So at the end of the examination, Dr. Barron, who was obviously the most important person in this examination, concluded that he thought James had died from an irritant poison which had caused inflammation of his stomach, which was what was found. So then an inquest into James's death was held, and it was first opened on the 14th of May at the Aigburth Hotel, but it was adjourned for 2 weeks so that more tests could be carried out. So by this time, Florence had seen a lawyer, and they were from the solicitors Cleaver and Arnold, and she told them that on Thursday evening, this would have been 2 days before James died, he begged her to give him some of his powder. Now, the medicine that he took. He did take it in liquid form, there were bottles of it, but he also had these packets of powder, and that was also what he used to take. Apparently, these were what he used to put in his drinks. So he was begging Florence on this night to give him some of the powder. And at first she said that she'd said no, that he wasn't well and he shouldn't be taking it, but he kept asking her. And she said that she didn't know what was in the powder, only that he kept asking for it and he just kept calling it medicine. So she hadn't known that there was arsenic in it. And she kept saying no until he badgered her enough that she ended up agreeing. And that's when she took the bottle of meat juice into her dressing room and she poured one of these powder packets into it. And that's, she mixed it up. And that's what was in the meat juice, the one that was tested for arsenic, the one that Michael had sent for analysis and had come back positive with arsenic. That was the reason why. So even though she was still ill in bed, she was spoken to by police officers in her room, and she was arrested on suspicion of poisoning James later that day. She was still shut in a room, but she was now, under the watchful eye of duty policemen as well as the nurses that were with her. Now, I'm not sure what the solicitor advised her to do, but Florence didn't seem to be using her common sense, if she had any. To be honest, this girl, you do feel like shaking her. I mean, I know she was only young and she was brought up, as a wealthy girl and probably didn't think that much for herself, but some of the things she did and said, it's like you really did feel like shaking her and saying, come on, don't do that, that's stupid. But she did do these stupid things. And she must have worked out by now that the staff didn't like her and wouldn't help her. And also that everyone in the house was basically accusing her of murdering James. She shouldn't have been trusting anyone in that house. They were all out together, it would seem. And you'd think that she would notice this as well. I mean, they locked her in a room. But she continued to do things that made her look guilty or wouldn't help her. While she was being kept under house arrest in a room, she wrote another letter to Alfred Brierley. Considering the first letter that she'd wrote got her in so much trouble, she didn't think and she did it again. So this is the second letter that she wrote. And she's basically asking him for money because, she knows now that she's in a serious situation and she's been arrested. So she's going to need legal help. And for legal help, she needs money and she hasn't got any. So I don't know how she thought this letter would get out of the house and to Alfred, but it didn't. Surprise, surprise. Alfred never received it. Florence stupidly wrote it while Mrs. Briggs was in the room with her. And what did Mrs. Briggs do? Well, she gave it straight to Michael Maybrick. Of course she did. Maybe, I mean, we don't know, but maybe Mrs. Briggs was fooling Florence into thinking she was on her side. I'm not sure, but it seems like Florence was very naive about the people she was living with. And when I did dig into it a little bit further, apparently Mrs. Briggs, even though she was an ex-girlfriend of James, she was a friend of Florence's as well. She had been like on multiple outings, just her and Mrs. Briggs together over a number of years. So they were friends, so I can kind of understand this a little bit. But at this point in time, considering everything that's happened, I wouldn't have trusted her anymore. Especially after she was searching her bedroom and going through her wardrobe looking for evidence against her. So obviously, up to this point, everything's just happened in the house. No one else knows what's going on. But it was bound to come out, wasn't it? I mean, now the police have arrested Florence, it's not going to keep quiet for much longer. And on the 16th of May, the story broke in the news. The newspapers were calling James's death the Maybrick mystery, amongst other things. The papers got hold of the fact that James had died under suspicious circumstances, and they ran with it. Well, of course they would. This was a huge story for them. They mentioned that he might have been poisoned and that there were tests needed to be carried out before the inquest could be carried out, and that the police were involved and had begun an investigation. So luckily for the family, the funeral had already taken place, so they didn't have to worry about loads of people turning up to that. Because it had already happened. It actually happened on the same day that the newspapers got hold of the story. But for Florence, this was another difficult time because this was her husband. You know, she knew, or was pretending to know, that she hadn't done anything to James apart from care for him when he was ill. Even though he'd done what he'd done to her. You know, she tried to stay loyal and help him while he was ill, and she wasn't allowed to go to his funeral. She had to sit there and watch the funeral car drive away with James's body in the back of the hearse and just sit there watching it out the window. She couldn't go. She was still arrested. She was still being watched by police in her bedroom. She wasn't allowed out. So James was buried at Anfield Cemetery, and that is where he is today. So people still go and visit his grave. He's still there. So, yeah, Florence was very upset at this, which makes me think that although he'd had his mistress and she was having an affair, she still cared for him. And that's what makes me think that she was innocent, because she was caring for him. She was, you know, trying to stop him from taking the medicine. And she knew that that was harming him, and she was there by his side day and night while he was ill. I mean, other people could say that she was there day and night by his side because she was poisoning him. Well, yes, she could. But in my opinion, I still think that she was innocent. I do believe that she wanted to help him, and I do believe that he begged her to give him some of his powder like she told the solicitor. Yes, she'd had an affair, but James had as well before her, and all during the marriage. Maybe she just wanted to be loved, and I don't think she should have been blamed for that. It really was so unfair that men could just do as they pleased and women weren't allowed to. You know, they had completely different rules, but she seemed to accept this and still care for the man, even though he'd done what he'd done. If it wasn't already obvious to his family that James had a mistress, after the story had broke in the papers, a man called at the house around this time who was a tailor, and he wanted his bill to be paid. Now, you remember all those debts that were outstanding, and they were trying to, claw their way back up with the wealth and into society and things like that. So they were trying to not pay all of the bills when they were needed to be paid. So this tailor's bill was outstanding, so he came to the house, wanted his bill to be paid. Now, this may not have raised any eyebrows if it was for men's suits for James, or if it was dresses for Florence, but it wasn't. The tailor proceeded to say that his bill was for dresses that he'd made, but not for Florence, for another woman. And as we know, there is no other woman in that house, no other woman that lives there, so why would James be getting dresses made for another woman who wasn't Florence? Well, obviously, it was his mistress, wasn't it? And apparently the tailor said that he'd made several dresses on lots of occasions in the past for James. And James had paid his bills, but this time he hadn't paid. So he wanted his bill, which was for £10, so not very cheap, and he wanted it paid. So yeah, this must have been for his mistress, for her dresses. But unfortunately, we don't hear anything more in this story about his mistress. She wasn't mentioned in James's will, and neither were any of those children, so it seemed like he just abandoned her. Yeah, and what a nasty thing to do. You know, I did say that he cared for Florence even though he'd done this to her, but to be honest, he can't have done. I mean, the type of person that would do that, that would have a mistress, 5 of his children, and he would just leave her without anything to, live on or bring those children up with. I think that shows what kind of person he really was. So I think that maybe Michael did know about her and there was some sort of secret arrangement to look after her and the children. Because if not, then James was a truly horrible, horrible person to leave that woman with nothing. So anyway, during all the searching of Battlecrease House, lots of medicines, potions and tonics have been found by the staff and police. Well, you can imagine it, can't you? You know that he's been taking this stuff for years and years and years. He's been going to the chemist multiple times a day for years, getting all these, these bottles and packets and stuff. And then he also had them come into the house, ones that he'd sent away for and that were getting delivered. So, yeah, there are a lot more than you might think, even with all that being said. Because when James's office was searched, and I think this is the office in his house, not the office that he shared in town with Edwin. Because according to Edwin didn't know about any medicines. And I think if James had been taking them at his office in the town, Edwin would have seen something. So I think this is that locked office that's in James's house. So in James's office alone, there were almost 30 bottles and boxes of pills. Some of these were locked away in his desk, but others were just, in drawers that weren't locked up. So I'm going to do a rundown of everything that was found in total. So we just talked about the 30 items that were found there. But there were also medicines found all around the house. So basically in almost every room, especially James's private rooms like his bedroom and his dressing room, there were tons and tons. It's like he could have had his own pharmacy with the amount of stuff that was found. So during those first searches and then also the subsequent searches after that with the police, Nurse Yap had still been looking because she was, she must have been proper sucking up to Michael at this point. And, you can just imagine her, can't you, trying to score points like, oh, I found some more in this room and now I've got even more. She was obviously trying to be, I don't know whether she was just trying to be helpful, but it sounds to me, like she was trying to be, oh, look at me, I'm the best at doing this. I'm helping more than anyone else and I'm finding all this stuff. So Nurse Yap afterwards found another 28 bottles of medicine and also a lot more pills. There were 51 medicines found in James's dressing room, and then they found another 24 in the toilet. By the way, they must have been very wealthy to have an actual toilet in the house. Can I just say that? So anyway, in total, 160 items, including liquid and powder medicines, tonics, ointments, tinctures and pills, a lot of which were clearly marked poison, were removed by the police. And rather than put all the blame on James, where it clearly should have been, they seemed to be siding with Michael and decided to take Florence to Walton Prison and away from the house. So by this time she'd already been charged with murder, just on the hearsay of her brother-in-law and the servants. So they had no proof that she'd done anything, but yet she was still accused. Michael didn't even live at the house, so he didn't see James on a daily basis, and this just shows that because he was an influential man, he had much more sway than James's own wife, who was with him most of the time. It really annoys me that women at this time, especially those in the upper classes, were seen more as pests rather than actual people with minds and opinions of their own. It's like they were just trophy wives, they were just there to hang off the men's arm and look pretty. They weren't supposed to think. They weren't supposed to do anything for themselves, just to make the men feel better and look better. So on the 30th of May, James's body was actually exhumed so that further tests could be carried out on his body. Obviously, they hadn't realised that this needed to be done before, but now the investigation was turning a bit more sinister towards Florence. I think they realised that, we need to get actual proof. So this was done very late at night, and it had been ordered by the Home Secretary himself. So they only actually removed his body at 20 past 11 at night. So Dr. Humphreys, Dr. Hopper, and Dr. Carter were there. They brought all their examination equipment. The body was placed on a board after being lifted out, and they needed to check whether there was a long-term problem with arsenic, and apparently they could find that out by taking a sample from his thigh bone and check if the substance was present and not just in his stomach. Now, this kind of thing had only happened once before. Exhumation was not a usual practice. It wasn't something that was normally done. Although traces of it was found, it was clear that there wouldn't have been enough in his system to actually kill James. So even though he'd been taking it for years and years and it would have accumulated in his body, they decided that, on testing these samples, it was shown that there wasn't enough. So that should have been it, shouldn't it? Case closed. Florence let out, she's not done anything wrong because he's not been killed by arsenic. There wasn't enough in his system. But really strangely, that didn't happen. On the 1st of June, things got worse for Florence because the letter that she'd written to Alfred Brierley was printed in the papers. I don't know how they got hold of it. It's the same now, isn't it? Things get leaked, and this letter got printed in the paper, which, sensationalised this case even more and made it even worse for Florence. So this was along with all the details that they printed after the inquest. So everyone had given evidence and all the reporters were there while the inquest was going on, and they were, printing everything sort of the next day or within the next couple of days. So all of the details were there for the public to read. The inquest was held at the Reading Room in Garston, which incidentally is also still there. Michael said during the inquest how he received the telegram from Mrs. Briggs, so that's why he came to Liverpool, where his brother Edwin met him. And it was at this time that Edwin showed Michael the letter that the nurse had given him that was supposed to be going to Alfred Brierley. And the pair of them, Michael and Edwin, discussed this on the way over to Battlecrease House. And it was after that that they sort of interrogated Florence about it. So once Michael arrived at Battlecrease House, that's when he saw Florence swapping the meat juice into another bottle and changing the labels. This was when Nurse Gore was off duty and Nurse Callery was with James. So Michael decided that after that, he probably couldn't trust Nurse Callery because she was letting Florence in and letting her basically mess about with things or not watching her properly. So he decided then that she was going to go, and he brought another nurse in, and this was a Nurse Wilson. So she took over. So another Maybrick brother, who we haven't mentioned yet, was also at the house at this time. His name was Reginald. And he was the one who went to see the neighbour, Mr. Steele, who was a solicitor. And he, advised them to lock everything, all the evidence away. So that's when they locked it in the wine cellar. On further questioning, Michael said that he didn't actually see Florence changing the liquid in the bottles or the labels, but she explained that she'd done it because of the sediment. So she'd basically told him that she'd done it, even though he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. He said that he'd given all the evidence to Inspector Baxendale on the Monday, and it hadn't been removed from the cellar before he arrived. He argued that he didn't call the police. They had to be informed because the doctors refused to issue the death certificate because of the supposed problem with the arsenic. So the next to give evidence was Nurse Yap. So this was the children's nurse, the one that didn't like Florence, and she was questioned about what happened on the night of the races. She said that Mr. and Mrs. Maybrick had come home separately around 10 minutes apart, and Mrs. Maybrick, who had arrived home first, went into the nursery to see the children. Mr. Maybrick then followed her in when he got home. She said she didn't hear them speaking while they were in the nursery, but then they moved into the bedroom and she heard their conversation. I bet she did. She was probably there with her ear pressed against the door. Apparently she heard James say, "It will be such a scandal. It will be all over the town tomorrow." Nurse Yap said that she stayed on the landing and the couple came out of the bedroom, and that's when she heard Mr. Maybrick say, "Florrie, I never thought it would come to this." So after that, according to Nurse Yap, the couple made their way downstairs, and when they were in the vestibule, she could hear him again, and Mr. Maybrick said, "If you once cross this threshold, you will never enter this house again." Mrs. Maybrick was standing still while Mr. Maybrick walked away, and Nurse Yap made her way over and helped her upset mistress back upstairs. So she's obviously claiming to be, like the caring staff member and all this, but we know that she wasn't. So she apparently, Florence apparently was upset, and Nurse Yap helped her get undressed and helped her get into bed. And the nurse said that she hadn't seen Mr. Maybrick go to bed. She, in fact, hadn't seen him after that point. She was then asked about what she saw in the dressing room, and the nurse said that she'd seen a basin with a towel over it, and when she moved it aside, there was another towel with an upturned plate under it, covering some fly papers that were soaking in water. She said that she put the towels back where they were and didn't tell anyone else about what she'd seen. But we know this isn't true because we know that she went straight to the sisters and told them, what was it she said? The mistress is poisoning the master. So yeah, we know that she was lying, and there was a few points where she lied in court, so she wasn't bothered. She knew exactly what she was doing. She must have really hated Florence. She also said that she hadn't seen any flypapers being used around the house for their intended purpose, killing flies. She said that on the day of the Wirral races, which I think was a week later, after the Aintree races, Mrs. Maybrick had told her that Mr. Maybrick had taken an overdose of medicine and that he was ill and in a lot of pain. The morning after this, he was ill again, and Mrs. Maybrick had asked her to sit with him. And when she returned, she had a cup which she said contained mustard and water, and she asked him to drink it, telling him, "This will make you sick." And obviously we know that that's true. This was on Sunday the 28th of April, and Nurse Yap said that she recommended to Mrs. Maybrick that another doctor should be called when Mr. Maybrick was ill again on the Friday. Mrs. Maybrick replied that Dr. Humphreys had told her that Mr. Maybrick's liver was out of order, and she also said that all doctors were fools, and the reason he'd said that was because it covered a multitude of sins. In other words, he didn't know what he was talking about. The foreman of the jury at this point asked if Dr. Humphreys was attending Mr. Maybrick at the time, and the nurse replied that he was. So, in other words, Florence had said these comments about him while he was actually there. He could have actually been stood next to her in the room. So, Florence mustn't have been his biggest fan. So, on Monday the 6th of May, Nurse Yap said that Mrs. Maybrick went out of town and she saw that Mr. Maybrick was really ill. So, she went into him and rubbed his hands. When Mrs. Maybrick got back, she asked her if she should call for Dr. Hopper. Mrs. Maybrick said that she wanted Dr. Hopper, but that Mr. Maybrick didn't. He wouldn't see him or take what he prescribed. The nurse said that she didn't believe this to be the case, although she didn't say it to her mistress. She then said that on the 8th of May in the afternoon was when Mrs. Maybrick asked her to go to post a letter to Alfred Brierley. She said that baby Gladys had been holding the letter and she dropped it in the mud outside the post office. The nurse said that she'd wanted to get a clean envelope to put it in, so she had to take the letter out of the old envelope. And that's when she saw the words, "My darling." And so she stood on the post office steps and read it, deciding then not to post it and to hand it to Edwin Maybrick instead. Later on that evening at around 8 or 9, the nurse had seen Mrs. Maybrick holding 2 medicine bottles, which she put down when she saw her. She also overheard Mr. Maybrick asking his wife to rub his hands, to which she replied that he always wanted his hands rubbed and it didn't do him any good. So she's painting this picture, isn't she, of Florence being this really bad wife and doing all these bad things. So she's still being questioned, and she says that on the 9th of May, Michael Maybrick had arrived at the house, and she, the nurse, was in the nursery at the time with Mrs. Maybrick. And Mrs. Maybrick said, "Do you know, I am to blame for this?" The nurse asked, "For what?" And she replied, "For Mr. Maybrick's illness. Mr. Michael blamed me for not having sent for another doctor and a nurse." She also said Dr. Humphreys said there was no need for another doctor, and Dr. Carter said on the Tuesday that there was no need for another nurse. Mrs. Maybrick said that she'd done all that Dr. Humphreys asked and all that she was told to do. So I think this is true, what Florence was saying. She was trying to listen to the doctors and trying to do what they said, but she still seemed to get everything wrong. It sounds like that saying, you can't do right for doing wrong. That's what Florence was doing. So when the nurse was cross-examined by Mr. Pickford, she said that she'd never seen Mr. Maybrick ill before the 27th of April, and she'd not been told to stop any letters. She said that after the quarrel at the races, the couple were occupying the same bedroom. Now, other sources say that they didn't. Other sources say that after the races, Florence was in a separate bedroom, so we don't know what the truth is about that. So that was it for the nurse's questioning, and now it was on to Bessie Briley. And there's a lot of similar surnames in this case. I don't know whether that's just coincidence, but yeah, this was the housemaid who was called Bessie Briley, and I'm assuming she's no relation to Alfred Briley. But she was the next to give evidence at the inquest. And when questioned about the night of the races, she said that she'd seen Mrs. Maybrick with a bonnet on, and she'd been asked to call a cab, but then she sent it away after it wasn't needed. She was the first one to see the basin with the flypapers in it around 11 a.m. On the Saturday, the day of the Wirral races, she met the Maybricks coming down the stairs, and she heard Mr. Maybrick say that his feet and legs were dead to his knees. He left that morning to catch the 10:15 train, and on Sunday he was ill again. On the following Friday, the 3rd of May, he came home ill from work, and she was asked to get a hot water bottle for his feet. On the 4th of May, he was in his bedroom all day, and the cook later on gave her a cup of arrowroot, which she gave to Mrs. Maybrick, who told her she was to see everything that was given to him first. Mrs. Maybrick said that the doctor had asked her to do this. Dr. Humphreys was present at the time. Mrs. Maybrick wouldn't let her change Mr. Maybrick's bed, and she wouldn't let her carry out her usual duties like emptying out the slops. Ooh, do you know what that is? I'm not going to elaborate on that. So instead, they were left outside the room for Bessie to collect, and not actually go into Mr. Maybrick's room. So obviously this isn't looking good for Florence, is it? This sort of secretive behaviour. But it might not have been that. She might have been trying to protect James, if he was ill and being sick and all sorts. Maybe she didn't want the staff seeing him in that state all the time. So the next to be questioned was the chemist who'd sold the flypapers to Florence. And his name was Mr. Thomas Wokes, and he said that when she came in to buy them, she said that flies were becoming a nuisance in the kitchen, which he thought was strange because he hadn't sold them at that time of the year to anyone else. She paid for them in full at the shop, even though there was an outstanding account for other things. So that would seem like she didn't want them on the bill. So maybe again, this could say that she was being secretive because she was using them to murder James. But also, she could have been secretive about it because they were her personal things and she wanted that kept separate from everything else. Another chemist, Mr. Christopher Hanson, said that on the 29th of April, Mrs. Maybrick had come into his shop and bought a lotion made up to her own specification, along with a dozen flypapers. She had the lotion paid for on Mr. Maybrick's account, but paid for the flypapers straight away, taking them with her. He said that he didn't usually see her in his shop in person, but he had sold items to her before. So that's 2 lots of flypapers which she didn't seem to want going on the accounts bought on the same day, or thereabouts, right after the argument they'd had at the races. So I can see how this does look a bit dodgy. So after this, it was the cook's turn to be questioned at the inquest, and her name was Elizabeth Humphreys. So the same surname as the doctor, so you see what I mean? The surnames are all the same. And again, I don't know if they were related, but she said that she saw Mrs. Maybrick with a bonnet on and heard Mr. Maybrick tell her she couldn't come back again if she left, which corroborates what the nurse said. Then she saw Nurse Yap take Mrs. Maybrick upstairs, which is also what the nurse said. She said that then she saw Mr. Maybrick pacing the hall and he was crying and clearly very upset. So, this is the first time that we've seen that after this argument, he was genuinely upset at what had happened. And he wasn't angry with her, he was upset, which makes me think that he did care for her, even though he was having this affair with this other woman. So the cook said that the flypapers had not been used by that time this year in the kitchen, as they hadn't been needed because there weren't any flies. She said that she saw Mrs. Maybrick give Mr. Maybrick some mustard water and he was vomiting, and Mrs. Maybrick told her he'd taken more of his medicine. Later on that evening he seemed to be better and asked to see the children. Mrs. Maybrick asked her to prepare some oxtail soup for him, which she took upstairs to him, but the cook didn't see him eat it. On Monday the 29th of April, Mrs. Maybrick asked the cook for some food to be made up from a tin. So this food was called Dubarry's food, and that's another surname that pops up later on, so remember that. But apparently this was like an early version of instant food, like I suppose instant mashed potato or something like that. So you would pour boiling water into it and it would make up, some sort of food, I suppose like porridge or something like that. It was supposed to be like kind of medicinal food, so to help people that were having trouble with different illnesses. So maybe that's why Mrs. Maybrick decided to give him this. So this, apparently, Mrs. Maybrick said that when this was made up, it was to be taken to Mr. Maybrick for his lunch at his office. On Tuesday, the cook was asked to prepare bread and milk for Mr. Maybrick's breakfast, and he was only to have that even though there was fish and bacon available. Mrs. Maybrick took it straight to him, but he didn't eat it and it was brought back. The cook had tasted it before it was taken to her, and afterwards she said it tasted different. She said it tasted sweeter than it had when she'd given it to Mrs. Maybrick, suggesting that Mrs. Maybrick had added something into it. So again, this isn't looking good for Florence. On the 3rd of May, the cook said Mr. Maybrick was taken ill again, and Mrs. Maybrick had brought her some liquid in a glass, which she said was beef juice, and that it was to be put in his soup. So she didn't do it. Mrs. Maybrick poured it in herself. And then on the 4th of May, some medicine arrived at the house, and the cook took it straight up to the bedroom where Mr. Maybrick was alone in bed. She told Mrs. Maybrick, but Mrs. Maybrick wasn't happy with her, saying that nothing was to be taken to him without her seeing it first. And she was angry with the cook for, taking this medicine up to him without her seeing it. And I can kind of see it from Florence's point of view. She's probably thinking that he's ill because of all this medicine he's taking. So she doesn't want the cook taking the medicine to him and then him just gulping it down and being in a bad situation like he was before. But you could also see it, whereas she doesn't want the cook taking it straight up to him because she's controlling what he's eating because she's putting arsenic in it or whatever. So later on, the cook asked how Mr. Maybrick was, and Mrs. Maybrick said that the doctor had told her that if he took any more of that London medicine, he would have been dead, and that she poured it down the sink. So on Wednesday, Mrs. Maybrick was outside the bedroom on the landing and said that Mr. Maybrick was worse. The cook asked if she could sit with him while Mrs. Maybrick rested because Mrs. Maybrick had told her that she'd been up all night with him, but she said no. The cook went up again later and asked for the dinner order, and asked if she could see Mr. Maybrick, and again she was told no, but this time she ignored Mrs. Maybrick and she followed her into the bedroom without permission. So to do that, she must have been quite desperate. And when she got into the bedroom, Mr. Maybrick called her to him and asked her to make him some lemonade, saying that he was dying of thirst and wanted a good drink, but Mrs. Maybrick said no. Instead, she offered him some lemon juice that she had in a glass. At least that's what she said it was. And she told the cook there was no point making him lemonade because he couldn't take it. The cook knew he'd just been sick. Mrs. Maybrick said that the doctor had told her he could only have anything like that as a gargle and he wasn't to drink it. The cook then asked him if he would like some barley water, but Mrs. Maybrick said that he couldn't have that either. She said he looked sad because he wanted it. So she made the lemonade anyway and took it up to the bedroom, and she was about to give it to Mr. Maybrick. Again, this is really bad because it just shows how much the staff really aren't listening to Florence. She's giving them orders saying, don't give him this, don't give him that. And the cook's just doing it anyway. So she's made this lemonade, she's took it up to him despite what Florence said. And she was about to give it to him when Mrs. Maybrick came over and took it out of her hand, saying that he couldn't have it. She said that she went up to him again later on and he seemed delirious, saying there were some strange things knocking about. So the cook said that she saw Mrs. Maybrick upset on the 9th of May and she told her that no one was listening to her. She'd lost her position in the house and she was being blamed for James's illness. On the 10th of May, the day before James's death, after eating the sandwich the cook had made for her, Mrs. Maybrick kissed her and said goodbye, which the cook thought was really strange. The next day at 3 a.m, Mrs. Maybrick asked her to get Mrs. Briggs because James was dying. So the next person to be questioned at the inquest was Mary Chadwaller, and she was like a waitress stroke maid for the Maybricks. She said that she'd been preparing arrowroot for Mr. Maybrick on the 28th of April when Mrs. Maybrick came over to her and told her she wasn't making it thick enough. Mrs. Maybrick then took over and finished preparing it herself. James ate it and was really sick afterwards. When Mary looked into the jug which contained the prepared arrowroot, she noticed something dark in there, which wasn't there when she'd been making it. So again, this doesn't look good for Florence, but is this true, or are the staff just making these things up because they didn't like her? When questioned about the meal taken to Mr. Maybrick at his office, so that's that instant food, she said that it had been made up from a tin, and this had been done for several days, each time being given to Mrs. Maybrick before it was taken, and she was alone with the food. Mr. Maybrick asked her if she put sugar in his bread and milk because it tasted sweet. So this is what the cook had said as well. She told him she hadn't put any sugar in it. 2 weeks after the Grand National, a delivery boy came to deliver some flypapers. Now this would make the third lot of flypapers that Florence had had. And the maid said it was strange because flypapers had not been used yet. It was too early in the year and there weren't any flies. So next, the nurses were questioned, and these were the actual nurses, not the children's nurse. So the first was Ellen Gore, and she said that she'd arrived on the 8th of May seeing Edwin Maybrick, who gave her instructions. When she checked the patient, Mrs. Maybrick was with him and handed her a bottle of medicine, asking her to give it to him. Later on, Mr. Maybrick said it was time for his medicine, but she told him she wanted him to eat instead of taking the medicine. After he had eaten, she wanted to give him the medicine, but she couldn't find the glass that he'd been using for this purpose. Mrs. Maybrick was on the landing at the time, so she asked her if she'd seen it, and she told her it was in the bedroom. So the nurse went back in to look for it, but was still unable to find it. And it was then that she went back onto the landing to find Mrs. Maybrick with the glass in her hand, and the medicine was already in it. She never saw the bottle it had come from, and Mrs. Maybrick said that the medicine needed to have water mixed with it so that it didn't burn his throat, but Nurse Gore waited for Mrs. Maybrick to leave and then she poured it down the sink. So she was obviously quite suspicious at this point, and she'd only just started. So I think Michael had been in her ear, or Edwin, basically saying keep an eye on Florence because we're suspicious. So Nurse Gore made a point of ensuring that until 11:30 the next day, the whole time she was on duty, Mr. Maybrick only took what the nurse gave him directly. She was relieved by Nurse Callery until she was back on duty at 11 that night. And at that time she was given an unopened bottle of meat juice by Edwin Maybrick, which she gave to Mr. Maybrick after she tested it herself first. Mrs. Maybrick told her that he'd had that before and it had made him sick, but the nurse didn't see this happen when she gave it to him. It was close to midnight when Mrs. Maybrick took the bottle of meat juice from the bedroom and into the dressing room, where she closed the door. When she came back in, she seemed to be hiding the bottle and asked the nurse to go and get some ice. The next morning, James said he had a jumping sensation in his throat. Later that day, the nurse told Michael Maybrick what had happened with the meat juice, and Michael took it away along with some brandy. Nurse Callery was the next to be questioned, saying that she arrived on the 9th of May, and all the food, drink and medicine given to Mr. Maybrick was given by her when she was on duty. The next day, Friday, she was asked by Nurse Gore to take a sample of the meat juice, which she did. Mrs. Maybrick was in the room with Mr. Maybrick for most of the day, and she frequently asked if it was time for him to have anything. And she heard Mr. Maybrick say to his wife, "Don't give me the wrong medicine again." She replied, "What are you talking about? You never had the wrong medicine." So obviously this is, again, looking a bit suspicious for Florence. But it could also be that James is so ill at this point, he's delirious, he doesn't know what's going on. And he might think the wrong medicine is not his favourite medicine that he's been taking for all this time. So another nurse, Nurse Wilson, so this was the one who was swapped for Nurse Callery, was also at the house, arriving on Friday the 10th. Her first shift was 4:45 p.m. until 11 p.m. And at that time, Nurse Callery and Mrs. Maybrick were both present when she heard Mr. Maybrick say, "Oh, Florrie, how could you do it? I did not think it of you." He said this 3 times, but did not seem delirious. Mrs. Maybrick replied, "You silly old darling, don't bother your head about anything." She then told Nurse Wilson, "We cannot think what's the matter with him or what's brought this illness on." She also said that she was present when Nurse Yap found the chocolate box in the trunk with the medicines in it. Another witness was a lady called Christina Samuelson, and she was the wife of Charles Wrighton Samuelson. She said that she and her husband stayed at the Palace Hotel in Birkdale a few weeks before the Grand National, and on that night Mr. and Mrs. Maybrick and Alfred Brierley were also staying there. She'd been speaking alone with Mrs. Maybrick when she told her that she hated her husband. On the day of the Grand National, they'd all travelled there together on an omnibus, and when it was time to leave, he witnessed Mr. Maybrick speaking angrily with his wife on the omnibus. Afterwards, Mrs. Maybrick said, "I will give it to him hot and heavy for speaking to me like that in public." So she was obviously really angry with the way that James had spoke to her at the Grand National, which you can understand it, can't you? She, at the time, didn't think she'd done anything wrong, or didn't think it was that bad. So another witness at the inquest, a Mr. Batesman of Virginia, said that he'd known Mr. Maybrick when he lived in America in 1886. At that time, he told him that he was in the habit of taking arsenic and his doctor had warned him of the dangers of doing it. Batesman also knew the chemist where Mr. Maybrick got his arsenic mix and confirmed that the clerks there, along with the chemist, were all willing to swear on oath to this. He was also witness to a Dr. Ward telling Mr. Maybrick that if he continued to take arsenic in the large quantities that he would certainly kill himself. Now, this information wasn't actually given at the inquest because this witness, even though, he offered to come to the inquest and tell them all this, it never happened. So it does seem like Florence's claim was true, that evidence was being withheld that would have helped her in her case. At 9 p.m, the inquest was adjourned until the 5th of June. So on the 5th of June, when it resumed, it was the doctor's turn to give their evidence. So the first was Dr. Hopper, and he said that he'd been the family's doctor for the past 8 years. He'd seen James on numerous occasions for nervous conditions, which was a polite way of saying they were a hypochondriac, which is what James was. And he'd also seen him for digestive issues, which he spoke openly about, and so this was heard by the jury. Apparently James had always suffered with these things. He told the court about Mrs. Maybrick coming to his house on the 30th of March with a black eye, saying that she wanted a separation from her husband and that he'd reconciled the couple. The doctor did say that at one point she said that she'd found her husband repugnant, but that they'd managed to make things work, even meeting together further to discuss the debts Mrs. Maybrick had mounted up in secret. She told the doctor about the debts when she'd come to see him that day with the black eye, and he'd advised her that she should tell her husband about it. The doctor further commented that Mr. Maybrick had a tendency to take whatever his friends recommended, and this sounds like a teenager rather than a fully grown man, doesn't it? Like, oh, well, they're all doing it, so I'm going to do it. To be honest, a lot of his behaviour seems like that. When James had fallen ill, the doctor prescribed prussic acid, which, in other words, is cyanide. So yeah, we know now how dangerous it is, but they didn't then. And it was a few days later that James complained of stiffness in his lower limbs, and then when he saw him again the following day, Mr. Maybrick said that he was sick. Dr. Hopper made a list of foods to help him rather than medicine, and he was used to Mr. Maybrick and his issues. So this list included beef tea. So this is where he's trying to get Mr. Maybrick to change his diet instead of just taking more medicine. So this list included beef tea. And when he was questioned about the arsenic, Dr. Hopper said that he'd never prescribed this, but it was in such small amounts in medicines that he couldn't see it causing the stiffness Mr. Maybrick had complained about. So next it was the turn of Dr. Humphreys, and he said that he'd been called to the house on the 29th of April, where he saw Mr. Maybrick in bed and his wife was in the room with him. Mr. Maybrick said that he felt pain in the area of his heart, and he told the doctor he was frightened of dying and frightened of paralysis. He told him that the symptoms started after breakfast. Dr. Humphreys said that he'd been called a few more times after that, but when he attended on the 3rd of May, close to midnight, Mr. Maybrick was in extreme pain in his thighs, and he said that he'd vomited twice. He saw him again the next day, and he wasn't in pain, but he was unable to keep anything down, not even water. The doctor said he advised him not to eat anything at all, and when he attended the next day, Mr. Maybrick said that his tongue felt filthy and he wanted something to clean it with. By the next day, Dr. Carter was also in attendance, and they witnessed that James had managed to keep some fluid down, so it was their opinion that he was going to recover. However, on the 9th of May, he was much worse with an irritated throat and lower bowel pain. Dr. Humphreys called on him 3 times that day. By the 11th of May, Mr. Maybrick was even worse, and the previous night, Dr. Humphreys admitted to himself that he thought he might die, although he didn't tell anyone else. He said that Mrs. Maybrick was with him constantly until the nurses arrived. He'd suggested to Mrs. Maybrick on the 30th of April that another doctor be called in, but she said that so many had already seen him and they hadn't helped, so she didn't see the need. And this was not what the staff were told. They were told, different things, so this is where the confusion happens. Under questioning, Dr. Humphreys admitted that he didn't know what someone suffering from arsenical poisoning would be like, but that he'd taken samples and handed them to the police on the 28th of April. There were only 4 drops of arsenic in the medicine prescribed, so I'm assuming that this is when the Fowler's tonic was prescribed, because that was the one that had a small amount of arsenic in it. So this was taken every hour, but Mr. Maybrick said it was hurting him, so the doctor then poured it down the sink so he couldn't have any more. Or was it to protect himself because he knew there was arsenic in that medicine? We don't know. Also, on this day, Alfred Brierley was in court, and he was identified as the man Florence stayed in the hotel in London with around the 21st of April, and they'd gone to the theatre together. So this seems a bit risky, doesn't it? So at this point, the public were booing and hissing at this, obviously because Alfred Brierley was the one who'd had the affair with Florence, and they thought this was a terrible thing. But then the judge brought everyone to order, and he said that he would throw everyone out if it continued, so everyone quietened down, and Alfred went back to sitting down. Mrs. Briggs was questioned and told the court that the letter to Alfred Brierley had been written when she was with Florence, so this was the second letter asking him for money, and this was read out to the courtroom. When questioned about it, Mrs. Briggs gave an answer that was regarded as sarcastic, and she was told off by the judge, after which she apologised. So this was really daft. It was like blown all out of proportion, that Mrs. Briggs had been sarcastic to the solicitors. And it's like, the evidence should be more important than that. But apparently, the judge went off about this. He weren't happy about it at all. So anyway, on the 6th of June, the inquest was concluded. Mr. Edward Davis, an analytical chemist, was questioned, and he said that he'd found arsenic in the bottles and packets given to him by the police. But there was none found in Mr. Maybrick's stomach, but it was in his liver and kidneys. The jury retired at this point, and they returned half an hour later with a verdict of guilty. So Florence was committed to trial, to which she made no reply. So obviously now that the facts of the case had been heard at the inquest, the papers were full of every detail that reporters could get their hands on. They were at the inquest, and so they heard everything, and they definitely printed a lot more than they do today. They printed absolutely everything, like word for word. And also, on the 1st of August, James's will was printed in the paper. In several papers, actually. It was first printed in the Bristol Mercury, and I'm sure it was also in other papers. But it wasn't just parts of it, it was the entire thing. Now, can you imagine that now, somebody's will being printed in the paper? They also printed the letters that Florence had written, and they were whole as well. So, yeah, all the evidence was basically printed in the paper, so the public didn't need to go to court. They could just read it all. It was noted that the will was made on the 25th of April, so that was less than a month before he died. In the will, he left everything he had in trust for his children, including the furniture and everything in the house, in trust with his brothers Michael and Thomas. He mentioned that Florence could remain in the house with the children and the furniture be used for them, but it would only belong to them and not her. Any income and money was also in trust and to be used by the brothers for the care and education of the children, which was to be left to the discretion of the trustees. Florence was allowed to keep the proceeds of the life policies that were made out in her name, and she was allowed to live with the children as long as she didn't remarry. There were no executors named in the will, only trustees for the children. There was also no provision or mention of James's mistress and the mother of his other 5 children who were living in London. So it's not going well for Florence, and that's before her trial even starts. So let's not forget that even before she married James, Florence was a rich girl. She was brought up in high society, so it's definitely plausible that she could have been so used to servants doing her bidding that she didn't treat them very well. This is just an opinion though, I don't have much more to go on than that, but she must have done something to rub the staff up the wrong way, especially Nurse Yap. She was saying things that weren't even true, just to get her in trouble, it would seem. It just seems weird to me that the servants themselves were finding all those medicines marked poison in James's rooms. They must have known he was taking them for all those years. I'm sorry, but the staff see everything, don't they? They must have seen him taking this medicine. It must have been obvious. But then again, why would they speak up? Because even if they did think Florence was innocent, with James gone, they obviously saw Michael as their new master, and they wouldn't have spoken or acted against him. Unfortunately, we'll never know the real truth. But, you know, if you're hired by someone, you don't want to lose your job. And so, you know, they wouldn't have gone against Michael, would they? The foreman of the jury wrote to the coroner telling him that he knew James personally and had heard him saying he took arsenic. Then he resigned from the jury, but no one outside the jury was told about it. So this is another instance where someone is confirming that they know James, that they knew he took arsenic, and again, it's been like just pushed under, just hidden. So this was between the inquest being concluded and the trial date. So it was on the 26th of July that a date for the trial was given, and that was the 31st of July, 1889. And unfortunately for Florence, her luck doesn't get any better because a Mr. Justice Fitzjames Stephen presided over the trial. And he was an absolutely awful man who had no sense of justice or fairness whatsoever. So I do just need to go off from the story a little bit here, because this judge was actually the father of one of the Jack the Ripper suspects. And I wanted to mention that because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this case, so was James Maybrick and also Michael Maybrick. So we've got 3 people to do with this case that were all suspected of being Jack the Ripper. So I'll just leave that with you. One of the reasons James was a suspect was because of his mistress, Sarah Robertson, and she lived in Mayfair in London, which was where the Ripper murders took place, and it was suggested that he couldn't be found because he committed the murders before fleeing back to Liverpool, which we mentioned earlier on. The major piece of evidence to connect him to the crimes, though, was a diary or a journal which had been hidden at Battlecrease House and was found when it was being renovated in 1992, almost 100 years after James died. Some people say that it was Michael Maybrick who was Jack the Ripper because of a message on the wall found near one of the victims, and this seemed to follow his songwriting style. And of course, he'd also been at Battlecrease House a lot and had made regular trips to London. But these are just basic details. The journal has never been proved to be authentic. In fact, at one point, the person who found it, or claimed to find it, said that he'd actually forged it. So yeah, this journal is a little bit iffy. There are people that swear that this is authentic, and there are people that say it definitely wasn't. And those are really interesting videos to watch. There are loads of people who've done videos about this connection and this journal. So yeah, I would recommend going watching some of those if you're interested in that. But we're sticking with Michael Maybrick, so we're going to move on to Florence's trial. So she's got this awful judge, Stevens, and the whole trial was a complete farce. Evidence from the hearing which would have helped Florence was left out, and other people changed their testimonies. Everyone seemed to be against her, and there was a lot of emphasis on, evidence against her rather than for, her side, and it just seemed to be very one-sided. So the trial took place at St George's Hall in Liverpool. And by the way, this is an amazing building. It's still there, and it's now a music hall, but it's actually open to the public and you can wander around. They even have a tour that you can take to see the courtroom as it was. So they've kept it as kind of a museum. So you can go in and actually stand in the courtroom where Florence Maybrick's trial took place. And they even have part of the tour where you can go to the rooms underneath where the cells were, and they've kept one of the cells that Florence was held in as it was back then. So you can actually go in and see that, which is really interesting. So if you can get to Liverpool, I would definitely recommend it. I've not actually done this yet, but I am definitely planning to do it because I want to see that for myself. So the building is actually open to the public. You can just go and wander around by yourself. But if you want to see these extra rooms, then you do need to book the tour. But back to the trial. So obviously this was 100 years ago. So it began on the 31st of August 1889, and Florence was represented by Sir Charles Russell and William Pickford, while John Addison QC, together with solicitors W.R. McConnell and Thomas Swift, acted for the prosecution. It would seem that the trial, as well as the other hearings, were biased against Florence, her evidence being left out or ignored, while circumstantial evidence was allowed and leaned against. So Addison opened the trial by talking about James and Florence's meeting and consequent marriage. He talked about James being a hypochondriac and also of Florence's affair with Alfred Brierley. Most of what had already been covered in the inquest, but obviously at the trial they have to go through it all again. So there were gasps from the crowd when Florence's time in London was mentioned, and the reporters seemed very interested in writing it all down. The very first prosecution witness at the trial, the same as in the inquest hearings, was Michael Maybrick, and he seemed to be showing a major dislike for his sister-in-law, Florence. His answers to the questions were wishy-washy, when they could have helped her defence, but they were more definite when they showed her in a bad light. He told the court that he had no idea his brother gave himself medicine or anything like that, and said that he'd never heard him saying that he was ill either. Florence's barrister, Charles Russell, put up a good fight and tried to get all the information out of the witnesses that would help Florence's case. While questioning Michael Maybrick, he reminded him of the letter that Florence had sent to him, telling him that his brother was taking white powder. But conveniently, this letter never made it into the trial because Michael had thrown it in the fire, although he did admit to receiving it and reading it. He also admitted that he'd spoken to his brother about it, as Florence had asked him to in the letter, but James had denied all knowledge of any powders and refused to talk about it again. Michael said that he took this to mean that Florence's worries were unnecessary and James wasn't taking any arsenic. Now, I don't believe this for a second. If he was bragging to anyone who would listen, then I'm sure he was telling his brother that he was taking it as well. The courtroom was packed on every day of the trial, and to confuse people, Florence was brought into the building an hour earlier than everyone else in an effort to minimise the chaos. Every man and his dog wanted to be there at this trial, and so many people gathered outside in huge numbers, hoping to be one of the lucky ones that got a front row seat to the proceedings, but only a few of them actually managed to get inside. Now, Florence hadn't been well, and for this reason, she was provided with a comfortable chair to sit in, rather than the bench that she would have been asked to sit on usually. And she wore full mourning wear, so she was dressed completely in black, along with a veil that covered most of her face. So at this time, the accused were not permitted to give evidence for themselves. So she had to just basically, during her trial, just sit there and listen to her brothers-in-law, the staff from Battlecrease House, and the doctors all tell their stories, just like it was when they were at the inquest, but she wasn't able to make any comments or give her side of the story. And this just seemed so wrong. And obviously, added to the jury's view being one-sided, how could they make a proper decision on whether she was guilty or not if they didn't have the full story? The only time she was allowed to speak was when she was asked, "How do you plead?" to which she answered, "Not guilty." And then again at the end, she was allowed to make a short statement. A few more details came to light during the questioning of the witnesses, including that after testing, arsenic was found on the jug and spoon used for the lunch taken to Mr. Maybrick at his place of work. So this was that powdered food called DeBarry's, and it was like, an instant food that came in a tin. So there was also arsenic found on 2 handkerchiefs. One was in James's bedroom that had been used to wipe his mouth, and another had been found in Florence's dressing gown pocket. According to the staff, the waitress, Mary Chadwaller, and the cook, Elizabeth Humphreys, they had burned several packs of fly papers that were in the kitchen, Mary telling the cook that she'd better destroy them before the policemen came. They explained under questioning that they thought fly papers could also be used for cleaning silk. That was what they'd been bought for. So did they burn them because they didn't want Florence getting in trouble? This would suggest that they did in fact like her, not as the rumours would make out. But they could have also done it so they wouldn't be blamed for anything themselves. It was also said that a James Poole, when in the company of some men, including James Maybrick some years earlier, a conversation that they were having had turned to poisonous medicines, and James joined in saying that he himself took arsenic, and Mr. Poole told him, "Don't you know, my dear friend, that the more you take of these things, the more you require?" Basically telling him, you shouldn't take that because you'll get addicted. But apparently, James just shrugged and walked off. A former servant of James Maybrick, Thomas Stansell, testified that for several years before his marriage, James Maybrick had regularly sent him out to buy arsenic, which he would put into beef tea and drink it that way. So when Florence finally got a chance to speak before the judges summing up, she broke down several times, but she managed to tell the court that she'd bought the fly papers to make a solution for a cosmetic face wash. She explained that before she was married and for years after this, she'd had a solution made up for her using arsenic, tincture of benzoin, elderflower water and some other ingredients. She lost the prescription for it in April, so she wanted to make up the solution herself. She explained that she'd had an eruption on her face. I think she meant some spots. and she wanted to get rid of them before a ball that she was attending soon after. She explained that when she'd been in Germany, she'd seen a solution some of her friends were using derived from flypapers soaked in elderflower water, which was then applied to the face using a handkerchief soaked in the water. To stop evaporation, she needed to make sure that the air didn't get to it, and that was why she put a plate over the soaking flypapers and then a towel over the top. She said that her mother was aware of this and knew she'd used it for many years. So this would completely explain what she was doing with the flypapers. And when I've done research into this, this was true. Apparently a lot of women did do this. But she'd sort of confounded herself by telling the pharmacist that she was getting the flypapers for flies. But maybe it was just because she didn't want to explain to the pharmacist what she was using it for. I mean, she might just not have wanted to discuss it with him. I don't blame her for that. But it did make her look guilty. She also spoke about the meat juice, telling the court that James was very upset and kept asking for his powder, telling her that it wouldn't harm him. So this was obviously the arsenic powder that he used to put in everything and drink. She said that she didn't want to give it to him, but after seeing how upset he was, she eventually got it for him and put it in the meat juice. When she'd mixed it and brought the bottle back into the bedroom, he'd fallen asleep, and so she never actually gave it to him. She said that she didn't know his powder was arsenic until Mrs. Briggs accused her. She added that she wasn't told that there'd been a post-mortem, and during the last few days, she'd been kept away from her husband, which would have upset him very much. She said that at the time, she wanted to explain the situation to Mrs. Briggs, but the policeman wouldn't allow her to. She also said that the day before James's death, she apologised for the wrong that she'd done him. I assume she means she apologised for the affair that she was having. So that was all that she was allowed to say at the trial, and after all of the evidence over several days, the jury had a lot of information to think about. The problem was that the jury was made up of mostly uneducated men. They were all tradesmen, butchers and bakers. They didn't understand the medical evidence that was given to them day after day. In fact, it probably would have made their eyes glaze over. They probably sat there thinking, I don't understand any of this. So the same was said about all of the medicines that James was taking. They didn't really understand that. So instead of listening to all of the evidence properly, they just kind of ignored it and they waited for the judge to sum up the trial, and that's what they made their decision on, which they shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. I've already said that the judge was an awful man, but apparently he was a good judge for his time. But the problem was that he was an old man when he was doing this trial. Back then people didn't have a retirement age. They could carry on working as long as they were able to or they wanted to. And Judge Stevens was going senile. He was making mistakes, getting dates mixed up, reading out letters which weren't supposed to be used as evidence. He was corrected several times by the defence and he wasn't happy about it. He unfortunately lent heavily on Florence's affair rather than actual evidence on his summing up. So, this wasn't a trial about whether Florence had had an affair or not. It was a trial about whether she killed him or not. But the judge, because he wasn't happy that she'd had an affair, that's what he was going on about, and that's what the jury were listening to. So Florence's case ended up being his last, and he was dead 2 years later, and he'd been sent to an asylum not long after this case had finished. So he was clearly not fit to have been presiding over this trial. This meant that the picture painted for the jury was that Florence was an American girl who married a rich Englishman, then cheated on him, wrote to her lover saying that she wanted to be with him, and then her husband died, Florence having brought arsenic into the house in the form of flypapers. So this was what the jury listened to. The doctors all had different opinions on the arsenic and whether it killed James or not, so they couldn't agree and couldn't be relied upon. Another problem for Florence was that in 1884, only 5 years earlier, 2 women had been convicted of murder by using arsenic in flypapers so that they could claim on insurance policies. And that was why, when the flypapers were discovered, it caused such a reaction. Arsenic was then found in James's body, and there you go. Presented with this evidence and not the correct information, the jury had been given a completely different story to what actually happened. So at 2:20 p.m. on Wednesday the 7th of August, the jury retired to consider the verdict, and they returned at 2 minutes to 4 with a verdict of guilty. Florence was asked if there was anything she wished to say, to which she replied, "I am not guilty." The judge donned his black cap and issued the death penalty. Florence shuddered on hearing it, bowing her head for a minute before shakily getting to her feet. She walked by herself, refusing the help of the warders, out of the courtroom, and at 6 p.m, her prison van passed through the gates at St George's Hall, pulled by horses on the way to Walton Prison. They had to travel quickly because a crowd of people in their thousands had waited outside and chased after the van as it left. The people were cheering her, despite the verdict, and when the judge left some time later, the crowd booed and hissed at him, and they did the same to the prosecution, so obviously the public weren't happy. It transpired that the general view before the trial concluded was that Florence would be found not guilty, and the public weren't happy that she'd been found guilty. When the result hit the papers, there was even more public upset, but they assumed, having not been at the trial, that the jury made their decision based on facts that the public didn't have access to. In fact, it turned out that none of the solicitors or barristers on either side had expected Florence to be found guilty, and it was as shocking to them as it was to the public. There was a public outcry, and petitions from all over the country poured into the Home Secretary. It was said that for weeks after the trial, he was unable to do his job properly because all his time was taken up dealing with the aftermath of this case. The news went round the world, and the world was shocked by it, not just England. Thousands upon thousands of professionals, so solicitors, barristers, doctors, and members of the public signed the petitions against her sentence. In Manchester alone, 30,000 people signed, and another 50,000 in Liverpool. It seemed that every town had its own petition, but still, Florence's execution had now been set for the 27th of August. While the petitions were being signed and throughout the aftermath of the trial, more information came in the form of newspaper articles, which we know have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Most of the articles were untrue or were exaggerated, which we know they still do today. One particular story was that the executioner, Mr. Berry, was so convinced of Florence's innocence that he'd refused to carry out the death sentence. But when he was interviewed, he said that he'd said no such thing, and if Florence didn't get a reprieve before the day, he would indeed carry out her sentence, having already made the preparations for it. It was also reported that during her trial, Florence had received 7 marriage proposals. She had become quite a celebrity. So this happens today, doesn't it? You've got a murderer that's up on trial, and, they get all these people, if it's a man, they get all these women writing to them, wanting to marry them and stuff like that. Well, that's what people were doing with Florence. So on the 16th of August, 1889, the Home Secretary had a consultation with the Lord Chancellor, and after almost 4 hours of debating, it was decided that a reprieve for Florence would be requested from the Queen. And on the 22nd of August, it was made official that a death sentence had been commuted to life imprisonment with hard labour instead. Although people were happy that she wasn't going to be executed, they had expected a sentence to be overturned, and they still weren't happy. This resulted in another round of petitions being made for a release, but unfortunately it wasn't granted. The jury's decision couldn't be overturned because the Court of Appeal had been founded by this time, but it was only used for civil cases. It would be the early 1900s before criminal cases were able to use it, and so the verdict went unchanged, and Florence spent 15 years of her life in prison. She was transferred from Walton to Woking Prison, where she carried out some of her sentence, being transferred at some point to Aigburth. Florence was obviously shocked and upset by the verdict for herself, but her main cause of grief was her children. She hadn't been allowed to see them since they were taken away from her home in Liverpool, and now that she was in prison, she was still unable to see them. Florence's mother thought that she should be able to take custody of them because she was the maternal grandmother, but because James's will had entrusted their education provision and their care to his brothers, now that Florence was in prison, it was up to them, and it was them that had the decision of who the children went to. The Baroness, Florence's mother, was angry about this, and Florence was upset at the fact that it was actually the children's nurse, Alice Yap, who, in the Baroness's view, had been the cause of Florence's downfall, that the children were now living with. After months of this going on, it was decided that the children would be fostered by a family with money and good social standing, and then it would be decided what would happen with them. Florence nor her mother were ever given the names or addresses of this foster family, who later went on to adopt the children, and the children took their name when this happened. It was thought that it would be better for the children to change the names and be completely removed from the situation for their own sakes, and sadly, Florence never saw them again. I wondered during the research if they ever found out who their mother was. Now, she was naive in many ways, especially in how she trusted people when she shouldn't. Her biggest mistake was letting the public decide her fate. The inquest and trial may have taken a completely different turn if the correct evidence was given. However, this was partly Florence's own fault. Her defence's hands were tied because when Florence had first instructed her solicitors, she told them that she wanted James's name to be spared, meaning that she didn't want anything to be known about his personal life. So she didn't want the public to know about his affair and his illegitimate children. This meant that when her affair came out, there wasn't anything to show her reasons for doing it or that they were having problems, which again made Florence look even more guilty. But even though she knew that was the case, she continued to keep this hidden throughout the entire proceedings when it could have helped her. But on the other hand, it could have also given her a motive to kill him, which was probably why they kept it quiet. Although it did eventually come out anyway, so she may as well have just used it as part of her defence. So you may be wondering what happened to Sarah Rogerson, the other woman. Well, I'm not sure what happened to her after James's death, but it was reported that she may not have actually been the only mistress he had, although I'm not sure how true this is. James apparently seduced Sarah when she was only 18, the same age Florence was when he first met her. He gave her only a pittance to live on, keeping her hidden from his friends and family, and left her nothing in his will. He did, however, give her some diamonds that had belonged to the family the year before he died, and the theft of these was also blamed on Florence. So while Florence was in prison, there was another court case going on with the Maybricks, and this was the Maybrick brothers against the Mutual Life Association. And this was regarding money that was paid to Florence under James's life insurance policy. So this policy was made so that Florence would get paid out on James's death, and that's what happened. And she used this money to pay for her solicitors because she'd wrote that letter, hadn't she, to Alfred Brierley asking for money, but he never got the letter, so she had to get money to pay for her defence, and this is what she used it for. But then it was argued by the insurance company that she couldn't profit from James's death because she'd been guilty of causing it. The Maybrick brothers, as part of James's will, took the company to court, having the belief that the money should be paid out and that it should go to the benefit of the children, because that was what was intended by James when he took the policy out. It was ruled in favour of the company in July in 1891, but then the Maybricks took it to the Court of Appeal, where in December 1891 they won, and the money, £1,800, was to be given to them on trust for the children. Even though Florence had been sentenced for James's murder, this shouldn't have affected third parties, i.e. the children, and therefore the policy should be paid out, not to Florence, but to the Maybrick brothers, and in effect to the children. So I'm not sure if it was Michael and Edwin or Michael and Thomas who was named as the other trustee in the will, but definitely Michael Maybrick was living in the Isle of Wight after Florence's trial. You know, he was already quite a famous person, and now he was famous for all the wrong reasons, and he just wanted to keep himself as far away from everything that was going on as possible. But then he did an interview afterwards, and the reporter had gone to the Isle of Wight to speak to him about it. But during this interview, I'm not sure whether this was just to get his sort of public status back, because obviously a lot of people weren't happy with the way that he was in the trial against Florence, and they didn't like him. So he was saying in this interview that the public view of him not liking Florence was wrong and that he did like her. And he said that she'd asked him for money on several occasions and he'd given it to her without question. He'd also taken her to dinner and to the theatre on multiple occasions throughout her marriage to James. He also said that he thought she'd be acquitted and didn't believe that she was guilty. But the reports on the trial were saying that he was really, sort of leaning on the evidence that was for the prosecution. So that doesn't really make sense. It makes me think, oh, well, he just wants to be famous again for his songwriting and he doesn't want to show his true self so that, he can carry on working. Because he was probably, if you think about it, in social circles after the trial, people probably didn't want to be anywhere near him, and he missed that side of his life and he wanted to carry on. But, again, we'll never know the truth. So it also came out during Florence's sentence, so while she was in prison, that just before James's death, glycerin, which was an ingredient in many medicines, and it was found in chemists all over the country, had been supplied to customers that year without being tested properly. And when it was tested by one particular person, it was found to contain arsenic. And that shouldn't have been there at all. Somebody who owned a chemist and used to get glycerin to make medicines in his chemist, he always made sure that he tested the products himself before he used them. He was very particular about it. And when he'd done it this time, obviously it came up and it hadn't done before. So he was quite scrupulous, but it just shows that other chemists probably weren't, and they didn't test their products. So the products that James ended up with had probably contained arsenic, but to be honest, that wouldn't have made a difference. The amount that we know he was taking, these amounts were small, so I don't think it would have made any difference. So then also during Florence's sentence, letters appeared in the papers. So again, these have been leaked by somebody. And these gave more information about the people involved in Florence's life, and they were really interesting, because one in particular was where Florence's mother had written to a friend, and she was talking about John Kay. And obviously John Kay was in that letter that Florence wrote, your letter under John Kay, that one that was read out in court. Well, apparently John Kay wasn't a name that Florence had used for Alfred. It was another person entirely. So he was actually a friend of the family, and he had been for many years. So this is Florence's side of the family. And she'd known him since before she met James. And he would occasionally visit and take her out to the theatre or for dinner. And apparently she went to London with him at the time she met Briley at the hotel. And it was John that she went to the theatre with during that time, not Alfred. Because I did think it was a bit strange that if they were having an affair, her and Alfred, that they'd, come out of the hotel and gone to the theatre together. That would have been a bit suspect, wouldn't it? But apparently no, apparently it was this John Kay. And it's unclear whether this John Kay knew about Florence and Alfred. So during this letter, Florence's mother, Carrie, also said that she could have got a divorce from James if she wanted to, because she could prove his infidelity. And we touched on this earlier, didn't we, about her not wanting to mention it in court. But Florence's mother obviously wasn't happy with this, and she thought that Florence should have said something. She also said that at the trial, James's clothing should have been examined, because apparently for years he'd been having suits made with secret pockets inside them where he would keep all his medicines. So that was how he took them all the time, because when he went out, he would have them in different places, like in his jackets and in his trousers. So that was quite interesting. So there was some more interesting information that came out, and this was about Florence's mother. And it tells sort of the story of her earlier life before she had Florence and when Florence was young. And this is all printed in the paper. This isn't from a letter. So, we have to take this with a grain of salt, because it could just be made up. And I'll, get into that. So apparently the story goes that she came as Miss Carrie Holbrook to Mobile, Alabama in 1859 while visiting her uncle. And she was very popular and had many admirers, particularly a young William Chandler, who was the son of a well-known lawyer. When Carrie went back home to New York, Chandler followed her, and then they were married soon after, and he was Florence's father. So he was this banker. Now, they were both very popular in society, so obviously this sounds like Florence and James, doesn't it? But soon after marrying Chandler and having Florence, Carrie met Frank du Barry, who was a captain in the Confederate government. And you may remember this name because this was the name of that food, the food in the tin that was like instant food. That was the same name. It's probably a complete coincidence, but I just thought that was interesting to note. So it was noticed by society that du Barry had taken a liking to Carrie, and soon afterwards William Chandler fell ill and died under suspicious circumstances. This also sounds like Florence, doesn't it? And what was strange about this was that Carrie didn't attend the funeral. So again, this sounds very like Florence, but it also means it could have just been made up by a reporter. Apparently, there wasn't an investigation into Chandler's death, but this affected Carrie's position in society. So there must have been some gossip about it. There must have been something. Otherwise, she would have still been going to the parties and all that, but apparently she wasn't. And she ended up moving to get away from what was happening. So Du Barry followed her, and they were married soon after. Again, so this is what happened with Chandler, isn't it? And it wasn't long after this that Du Barry was sent to Europe, and Carrie, along with her 2 children, travelled with Du Barry. And on this voyage, he fell ill and also died, which is weird again, isn't it? Very, very weird. Apparently, the captain wanted to return to the port when Du Barry died, but Carrie talked him into throwing the captain's body overboard instead, and the ship came to England anyway. Now that, I don't know whether to believe this or not. It sounds very, very far-fetched. So apparently, according to this same person, 2 years later, Carrie ended up back in New York, where she was involved in a scandal with an actor. And then after that, she came back to England again, marrying Baron von Rock, and this is where she became the Baroness. But apparently, he wasn't a good husband, and he was cheating on her, and he also gave her a bad beating, so she left him. And after that, she married someone else, a British legation officer in Persia. So that's one story. But the other story says that after her first husband's death, so Chandler's, she married Du Barry, who was a French nobleman, and he was involved in a battle near Charleston and was badly wounded. And this was when he was put on the ship. So while he was put on this ship, he was already wounded. And then unfortunately, that ship was fired on as well, and he ended up dying on the journey. So I tend to believe this second one. The first one sounds completely fabricated so that it ties in with what Florence apparently did to James. So I think that one was made up. But we don't know. We'll never know. So I just thought that was really interesting and thought that I should add that in as well. Because the first story seems to say that Florence's mother killed her husbands, and maybe she taught this to Florence as well. And it had me wondering for a while, especially given the secrecy that Florence had about, mixing the meat juice and things like that. But to be honest, all that about Florence's mother probably was written afterwards, and it was just made up. In all honesty, Florence could have been poisoning James over time. She could have known that he was already taking arsenic, and she'd just help him along a little bit. Her getting annoyed at him for getting annoyed at her because she'd had an affair when she knew that he'd already had an affair and he had these secret children. And it could be that, she learned how to poison people with arsenic from her mother because she'd done it before. But it's all a bit iffy, isn't it? I'm sure that he killed himself with everything that he was taking. It just, it's proven, isn't it? He seemed to love arsenic. There was also a report that close to their house, so this is Battlecrease House where James and Florence were living, there was a case where some dogs that were constantly barking and making a noise, and James didn't like because he kept complaining about the noise. Soon after this, these dogs all died, and apparently they were poisoned with arsenic. So that's something else as well, isn't it? The arsenic was listed as poison, for rats and rodents and even cats, but I'm sure it would have worked on dogs as well. So as late as 1894, 5 years after Florence's sentencing, people were still petitioning for a release, and more people were saying that they were prepared to swear on oath that James took arsenic regularly, but nothing was done. In 1897, Ambassador Hay from America requested a release on account that she was an American citizen, and she still was one even though she'd married an Englishman, and therefore she should have been released back to America. But this was also denied. And apparently this was all down to Queen Victoria because she had a really dim view of infidelity. And when she learned that Florence had had an affair, she thought that this was criminal, so she should never be released. And that was the reason why she had to finish her sentence. And that was on top of the fact that the Court of Appeal couldn't reverse her sentence. Florence was only released on the 1st of February 1904, and she was released to a refuge home, which is thought to be a convent in Truro in Cornwall. She spent 5 months there until her official release on the 20th of July. So on that day, she left the convent, walked to a friend's house, and then they caught a train together, whereafter she travelled to Rouen to be with her mother before travelling to America. So either while she was in prison or afterwards, she wrote a book called My Lost 15 Years. And this is available to buy, so this is in her own words, and you can actually get this. And then after this, she travelled around America giving talks about her life. In 1905, she attended a service at the Baptist Temple in Philadelphia, where she shook hands, apparently, with 4,000 people who believed in her innocence, after which she was reported to have collapsed because she was so overcome. When in Rouen, in France, she'd had an interview with a reporter at her mother's house, and she told him that the first 5 years in prison were the worst of her life. She said that her mother kept her alive during that time, and she in turn had done the same for her mother, so they kept each other alive. She also said that before the trial, she'd been told to sign papers which she hadn't read, and to be honest, at the time she was probably signing all sorts, so she would have just signed it without properly reading what it was. But apparently she'd unknowingly signed over her property in America, and this was land worth £1 million. She said that she'd attempt to reclaim this, and in 1908 it was reported that she'd won the case, but I'm not sure what happened with this because in 1918 she was reported as destitute and was looking for work as a housekeeper. Now again, these are all reports in the paper, so we don't know how true these are. Other reports said that she was working as a writer to make ends meet because she couldn't afford to pay for the legalities of reclaiming her land. She did, however, manage to pay for a small piece of land where she had a tiny cottage built. It only had 2 rooms. And at this time, she'd gone back to her maiden name of Chandler, which I don't blame her for. At the time of her death in 1941, she was 79 and living in a rundown shack of a house in Connecticut, surrounded by cats. The locals didn't know who she was, and they just called her the cat lady. But someone must have found out because her death was printed in the paper, and it was again under the name of Maybrick, so she was famous again. It's such a sad story, but it's one that keeps giving, and there's so much information, it's hard to keep up with. And I know that this video is really long, but I wanted to add in as much information as I could. I did as much digging into everybody's background as I could and what happened after the case. So after doing this and after digging into what happened with the children, it turns out that Michael did in fact have a lot to do with the children's lives after the mother was incarcerated, and he may have even adopted them himself at some point. They did stay with Nurse Yap briefly, but apparently after that they stayed with Dr. Fuller, who was Michael Maybrick's doctor. It's thought that Michael then took them in himself. He made sure that they thought their mother was the reason for their father's death, and very sadly, little Gladys grew up believing her mother to be a murderer. That was really cruel. I'm sorry, but that just proves what a person Michael was. That's disgusting. Saying in the paper that he believed she was innocent and then telling her children who she was. So Gladys, when she was grown, was never interested in seeing her mother because what she'd been told. And I think this is so sad. And what's also really sad is that she never had children herself because of what her mother had done, or apparently done. So that's awful how it's impacted her life. But not only that, there's another really sad part to this story, and that's that James Jr., Gladys's older brother, also died without having any children. But his death was also a tragedy. He was engaged to be married and was working as a mining engineer in Canada. And while he was down one of the mines, he'd had 2 beakers with him on one particular day, and one had water in it and the other had cyanide in it. And by mistake, instead of drinking the one with water in it, he drank the cyanide and ended up killing himself by accident. I actually thought this might have been made up, but there were reports of the inquest that was carried out after his death, so it turns out to be true. So Florence has, got old and died without her children ever knowing who she really was. So I can't end this video without discussing the connection with Jack the Ripper. Obviously, he and James were both living at the same time, and James had his mistress hidden away in the Whitechapel area, and we've discussed about the journal coming out. So obviously this was 100 years later in 1992 when the journal was discovered. And although it doesn't name James in the journal, from some of the entries, apparently it was clear that it was him who had written them. So along with this journal, there'd also been found a gold watch, and this was engraved with the initials of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And apparently the person who found the journal admitted some years later that it was fake, but then he retracted this, so it really is a mystery that may never be solved. But like I said earlier in the video, there are lots of websites dedicated to this journal and the watch, and also YouTube videos, so I would definitely recommend going watching some of those if you're interested in that. So finally, I just want to ask what your opinions are. What do you think about Florence? Do you think she was guilty? Or do you think that she was just a terrible statistic? Or that she was failed by the judge and the jury who didn't understand all the medical evidence? As usual, I would love to hear your theories and opinions on this case, so please let me know in the comments. I'm so interested to find out what you think. Or if there's any other information that you know that I've missed out. Also, please let me know if there are any other cases for this sort of time period that you'd like me to cover on this channel. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.